"Get your hands off my counter, Marcus." Clara Bennett said it quietly. No trembling. No apology. Just 8 months of swallowed fear finally hitting the floor, and every person in the Willow Creek post office heard it land. Marcus Caldwell went very still, because Clara had never spoken to him like that. Not once. Not in 8 months of doing exactly what he wanted, saying exactly what kept her safe, surviving the only way she knew how. But there was a stranger standing behind Marcus right now. A rancher from the hills. And something about the way he was watching, patient, steady, not looking away, had changed the temperature of everything in this room. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to your heart, please subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Willow Creek. The post office in Willow Creek, Montana had seen better days, and so had Clara Bennett. She arrived every morning at 7:45, 15 minutes before she was required to, because the walk from her house to the post office was the only time in her day when no one was watching her. 15 minutes where she could breathe without calculating what her breathing looked like. 15 minutes where she didn't have to hold her face in the right position. She unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and became Clara Bennett, postal worker. Reliable, quiet, untroubling. It was the only performance she had left that she was still good at. The morning Ethan Walker arrived in Willow Creek was a Tuesday in late October. Clara knew it was Tuesday because she always sorted the Hendersons' mail on Tuesdays and left it in a separate pile, the way old Mrs. Henderson had asked her to 11 years ago when Clara had first taken the job. Mrs. Henderson had been dead for 4 years, but Clara still sorted the mail the same way, because some habits were the only proof you had that life had once been gentler than it was now. She was standing with her back to the front door, organizing a stack of certified letters, when she heard the bell above the door ring. She did not spin around. She turned slowly, deliberately, because spinning around made her look afraid, and in Willow Creek looking afraid was the same as admitting something, and admitting anything gave people power over you. She turned around and saw a man she had never seen before. How was tall and not tall in the way the Caldwell men were tall, that manufactured look down at you kind of tall, that was really just arrogance wearing a body. This man was tall the way someone gets after years of physical work. His jacket was worn at the elbows. His boots had real mud on them, not decorative dust. His face was the face of a man who had spent decades outside in weather that didn't ask his permission. How was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly between his fingers. Not nervously, just the way a man holds something when he's been taught that you don't wear a hat indoors. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Clara said back. Her voice came out exactly the way she'd practiced it. Level, neutral, appropriate. "I'm looking to file some paperwork on a land parcel out on the Miller Road side," the man said. "Name's Ethan Walker. I've got a ranch up in the hills, been up there about 12 years, and there's a boundary dispute that apparently needs to be resolved through the county recorder's office, and I was told that was here." "The county recorder's office shares our building," Clara said. "They open at 9. You've got about 20 minutes. All right." He nodded. He didn't move toward the door. Clara turned back to the certified letters. "You need anything else?" she asked without turning around again. "No, ma'am," Ethan said. "I'll just wait if that's all right." "Waiting rooms through that door on the left." She heard him move. She heard the door on the left open and close. She let out a breath that she hadn't been fully aware she was holding. She went back to sorting mail. 22 minutes later, the door on the left opened again. Clara had known it would. The county recorder, Dennis Pratt, was a slow man in all senses of the word, and land boundary disputes were the kind of thing he enjoyed complicating. She had guessed the stranger would be sent back out for some form he didn't have, or some document that needed a notary seal, or some other piece of bureaucratic theater that Dennis had elevated to an art form. She had been right. "Excuse me," Ethan Walker said. Clara looked up. "He tells me I need the original survey document, the one from 1987. He says it would have been filed here originally." "Survey documents older than 15 years are in the archive room," Clara said. "I can pull it for you, but it takes some time." "I'd appreciate that." Clara came around the counter. She moved carefully the way she always moved, now deliberate, measured, no sudden gestures that might draw attention to herself. She was aware of the specific distances between herself and the furniture. She was aware of the space between herself and this man she didn't know. She was always aware of spaces now. She had learned to be. She opened the archive room door and began pulling the relevant index drawer. She found the 1987 survey files and started sorting through them, aware that Ethan Walker had followed her to the doorway and was standing just outside it. She did not ask him to move back. She told herself that was because he wasn't in her way. It had nothing to do with the fact that having him between her and the main door made something in her chest tighten in a way she recognized and hated. She found the survey document and pulled it free. When she turned around, she saw that Ethan Walker was looking at her. Not the way men in Willow Creek looked at her, that careful, studied not looking that somehow communicated everything. Not the way women in Willow Creek looked at her, the pitying slide of the eyes that lasted exactly long enough to fulfill the social requirement of acknowledgement before moving on. I was looking at her the way you look at something you're genuinely trying to understand. Clara handed him the document. "You'll want to take this to Dennis," she said. He took it, but he didn't look at it. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. It was a perfectly ordinary question. There was nothing in it that should have made her throat close the way it did. 11 years, she said. He nodded slowly. "You like it?" "It suits me." "Quiet job," he said. "Not a judgment, just an observation." "Most of the time," Clara said. "You should take that to Dennis before he decides it needs another form." Ethan Walker looked at her for one more moment, that same careful, direct, non-intrusive looking, and then he said, "Thank you, ma'am," and turned and went back through the door on the left. Clara stood in the archive room doorway for a moment. Her hands were trembling very slightly. She put them flat on the counter and pressed down until they stopped. He came back at 11:45. Dennis had predictably sent him away for a notarized statement from his bank, confirming he had legal authority to modify property records in his name. It was exactly the kind of thing Dennis did. Clara had already pulled the relevant form from the rack and had it waiting on the counter when the bell rang. Ethan Walker stopped when he saw it sitting there. "Dennis is going to need you to fill this out and get it notarized," Clara said. "Nearest notary is Helen Park at the bank. She's on her lunch break until 1:30, but she'll take walk-ins after that." He picked up the form. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. "Did you do that before I walked back in?" he asked. "I know how Dennis operates," Clara said. A very small smile moved across Ethan Walker's face. Not a broad smile. Not the kind that asked for anything in return. Just the kind that happens to a face when something pleases it honestly. "That's kind of you," he said. Clara shrugged with one shoulder carefully and went back to the packages on the sorting table. "It's efficiency," she said. "It saves time." She heard him fold the form. She heard him put it in his jacket pocket. "I'll be back after 1:30 then," he said. "I'll let Dennis know." She heard him move toward the door. The bell rang. The door opened. Then it closed, but only halfway. "Ma'am," Ethan Walker said. Clara looked up. He was standing in the half-open doorway, and he wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her left hand, which was resting on the edge of the sorting table. At her wrist, where the sleeve of her cardigan had ridden up slightly when she'd reached for a package, where the bruise was. The one she'd been careful about for 3 weeks. The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. Clara counted them. She became very good at counting silences. Then she pulled her sleeve down, smoothly, the way she'd practiced. "The bank's on 3rd, she said. "Helen Park. She's good, she won't make you wait." Ethan Walker stood in the half-open doorway for one more second. "Thank you," he said. And he left. Clara did not move for a full minute after the bell stopped ringing. Then she went into the small bathroom at the back of the post office, the one that locked from the inside, and she sat down on the closed toilet lid, and she pressed both hands over her mouth, and she breathed through her nose, slow and even until the shaking stopped. Nobody saw it. That was the whole point. Nobody in Willow Creek saw anything they weren't supposed to see. It was the town's most carefully maintained tradition. She thought about the way Ethan Walker had looked at her wrist. Not with horror. Not with that particular kind of fascinated revulsion that she'd seen on a few faces early on before everyone had agreed that seeing nothing was easier. Not with pity. Not with that suffocating, helpless pity that was worse than indifference, because at least indifference didn't require her to manage anyone else's feelings about her situation. He'd just looked. The same way he'd looked at her face. The same careful, direct, non-performative attention. Like she was a person worth looking at. She hadn't felt like a person worth looking at in a long time. She stood up, unlocked the bathroom door, and went back to sorting mail. He came back at 2:15. The notarization had taken longer than expected, which Clara could have predicted, because Helen Park at the bank was thorough to a fault and didn't like being rushed. But she hadn't said that because it would have seemed like she was too interested in his schedule. She was not interested in his schedule. She processed his paperwork. She walked him back to Dennis Pratt's office herself because Dennis had a habit of losing things, and a land boundary dispute with a missing document had a way of becoming a 6-month ordeal, and she was efficient. That was all it was. She sat in the plastic chair outside Dennis's office for 20 minutes, while Dennis explained the process in his deliberate, detail-oriented way, because someone needed to make sure the documents were filed correctly and not left in the wrong pile, and that was part of her job. It had nothing to do with the fact that the conversation happening inside Dennis's office was the most animated she'd heard Ethan Walker's voice, and that she found herself paying attention to the sound of a voice that wasn't calibrating itself around her, that wasn't choosing words based on what they might set off, that was just talking. Normally. Like normal was still something that existed in the world. She was nearly back to the front counter when Ethan came out of Dennis's office and fell into step beside her. "Thank you for that," he said. "I have a feeling that without you in the building, that document would have ended up in the wrong county." "Dennis means well," Clara said. "That's a very diplomatic answer." "I work in local government," Clara said. "Diplomacy is part of the job." He laughed. It was a short laugh, honest and surprised out of him, and it hit Clara somewhere in the chest in a way she didn't examine too closely. They reached the front counter. Clara moved behind it. She began straightening papers that were already straight. "I'll be in town for a few days," Ethan said. "The ranch supply store has a back order I've been waiting on, supposed to be in by Thursday." "Millie's Hardware or Caldwell Supply?" Clara asked, and she heard her own voice say it and felt her jaw tighten slightly at the second name. If Ethan noticed, he didn't show it. "Millie's," he said. "I don't do business with the Caldwells." Clara's hands stopped moving on the papers. She looked up. Ethan was watching her with that same direct, unhurried attention. "You know the Caldwells," he said. It wasn't a question. "Everyone in Willow Creek knows the Caldwells," Clara said carefully. "That's not what I mean." The silence came back. Longer this time. 7 seconds. Clara broke it first because she'd learned that letting silences go on too long gave them weight that was harder to manage afterward. "The Caldwells own a lot of this town," she said. "The supply store, the main office building, 3 of the 4 largest ranches. They've been here since before my grandparents." "And the sheriff?" Ethan asked. "He on their payroll?" Clara's hand found the edge of the counter. She pressed down on it slowly. "Sheriff Hayes is an elected official," she said. "That's also not what I mean." She looked at him. He looked back. "I should close up the back windows before it gets dark," Clara said. "Is there anything else you need for the paperwork?" The pause before his answer was brief, respectful. "No," Ethan said. "I think I have everything I need. Thank you, Ms. Bennett." She hadn't told him her name. He must have seen it on the window, on the small nameplate. She was sure that was it. "You're welcome, Mr. Walker," she said. "Have a good evening." He put on his hat. He nodded once, the kind of nod that carries more weight than it looks like, and he left. That night, Marcus Caldwell came to Clara's house. She had known he would. She'd known it from the moment she'd pulled into her driveway and seen the tire tracks in the gravel that weren't hers. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. She had almost driven away. She had sat in her car in the dark for 4 minutes and thought about all the places she could go, and she had understood, not for the first time and not for the last, that there was nowhere. Willow Creek was small, and the Caldwells were large, and every road out of town ran past something they owned. She went inside. She changed her clothes. She put on the kettle. Marcus knocked at 8:30, which was courtesy, in the way of a cat, presenting a dead bird technically a gift wrong in every other sense. She opened the door. Marcus Caldwell was 29 years old and had his father's eyes and his grandfather's sense of ownership. He was not a large man physically, but he had learned very early in his life how to fill a room in a way that had nothing to do with size. "Clara," he said, and he smiled, and the smile was the most frightening thing about him. "Marcus," she said. "My father heard there was some stranger asking questions at the land office today." He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "Thought I'd come by and see how you're doing." "I'm doing fine," Clara said. "Thank you." "Who was he?" "A rancher," Clara said. "He had a boundary dispute he needed to file. It's a matter of public record." "A rancher from where?" "From the hills," Clara said. "He has property north of the Miller Road parcel." Marcus's smile stayed exactly the same. That was the way it never shifted, never reached his eyes, never changed in response to anything. It was a fixed thing, like something painted on. "You spent a lot of time with him today," Marcus said. "For a simple filing." Clara said nothing. "My father has been very generous with you, Clara," Marcus said. "With this post office, with your employment, with the arrangement we have." "I know," Clara said. Her voice was level. She was proud of it. "He just wants to make sure you understand that generous arrangements depend on behavior that supports them." "I understand," Clara said. "Good." Marcus pushed off the doorframe. "Then we don't have anything to worry about." He started to turn. Then he stopped. "Oh," he said, like it was an afterthought, like he hadn't been saving it. "If that rancher comes back into the post office, I'd like to know what he's asking about, just as a courtesy." Clara looked at him. "Of course," she said. Marcus smiled. He walked to his truck. He drove away. Clara stood in her open doorway for a long moment, feeling the cold air on her face. Then she went inside, locked the door, and sat down at her kitchen table. She put her hands flat on the table. She did not cry. She had stopped crying 8 months ago when she'd realized that crying took energy she couldn't afford to waste. She thought about the rancher's voice when he'd said, "I don't do business with the Caldwells." Like it was the simplest thing in the world. Like it was just a fact, and facts didn't frighten him. She didn't expect to see him the next morning. She was standing behind the counter at 8:15 earlier than usual because she hadn't slept well, and the bell rang, and she looked up, and there he was. Ethan Walker. No hat this time. He was carrying 2 paper cups from the diner down the street, and he set one on the counter in front of her without preamble. "Dorothy at the diner says you take yours black," he said. Clara stared at the cup. "Dorothy talks too much," Clara said. "She talks just enough," Ethan said. He leaned his forearms on the counter. "I wanted to ask you something, and I'd rather ask it here than somewhere more public." Clara's hands wrapped around the coffee cup. The warmth of it moved up through her palms. "All right," she said. "Last night." Ethan said. "I was eating dinner at the diner, and Marcus Caldwell came in. He sat at the counter for about 10 minutes. He didn't order anything. He just talked to Dorothy, and then he left." He paused. "I watched the way Dorothy looked when he left the diner." Clara said nothing. "It was the same way you look," Ethan said, "when you've just said something to someone because you had to, not because it was true." The silence was very loud. "I don't know what you mean," Clara said. "Yes, you do." She looked up at him. She looked him full in the face, which she rarely did with people. It gave them too much. Let them too close made the distance harder to maintain. Ethan Walker looked back at her without any of the things she expected. No impatience, no agenda, no performance of concern designed to get something. Just that same steady quiet looking. "Mr. Walker," Clara said, and her voice came out lower than she meant it to. "You should finish your land filing and go back to your ranch." "The filing's done," Ethan said. Dennis got it through first thing this morning. Then you should go home. I'll go home Thursday, Ethan said. The back order at Millie's isn't in until then. Then you should go back to your hotel and leave this alone. What is this? Ethan said. Clara looked at him. You know what it is, she said before she could stop herself. And then she heard her own words and felt something cold and immediate flood through her, the way it always did when she said something true in the wrong place to the wrong person. But Ethan Walker didn't move closer. He didn't lean in. He didn't make any of the moves that men made when they thought they'd found an opening. He just nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd already understood. How long? He asked. That's not... How long, Clara? Her name. Just her name, the way someone says a name when they mean it, not when they're performing intimacy. She pressed her lips together. A long time, she said. And nobody. Please don't, she said. Please don't say whatever you're about to say. He stopped. You don't have to save me, Clara said, and it came out barely above a whisper, and she hadn't meant to say it, and she couldn't take it back, and it was true in a way that 8 months of silence had compressed into something very small and very heavy. You don't have to do anything. You're not from here. You have a ranch and a life, and this isn't your problem. Please, go home Thursday and don't come back. Ethan Walker looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, I'm not leaving. Clara stared at him. You don't understand what you're saying. I understand exactly what I'm saying. The Caldwells. I know who the Caldwells are. They'll destroy you, Clara said, and her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough that she heard it and she hated it. They've destroyed people who were stronger than either of us. They have the sheriff. They have the judge. They have half the businesses in this town. You can't fight that. I'm not going to fight it, Ethan said. Not today. Not like that. Then what are you going to do? He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup. He took a sip, and when he set it back down, he was looking at something past her shoulder, thinking. I'm going to start by finding out who else in this town has been told to look the other way, he said. Because what I saw in Dorothy's face last night, that wasn't one woman's secret. That was a town's. Clara shook her head. People here don't talk. They've been quiet too long. They're too afraid. Fear changes, Ethan said, when people stop feeling alone in it. He looked at her again. Did you know that Dorothy's been overcharging her electricity bill by 30% for 2 years because the building she rents is owned by Caldwell Properties and she's afraid to complain? Clara blinked. She told you that last night. She told me that when I asked how long she'd been at the diner. Ethan set down his cup. People will tell you things, Clara, when they trust that you're not going to use them. When they believe you're listening because you actually care and not because you need something from them. And what did she say when you told her you were going to help? I didn't tell her that, Ethan said. Then why did she tell you about the electric bill? Because, Ethan said simply, I asked her if she was all right. Clara stared at him. That's it. That's it. And she cried for about 30 seconds, Ethan said. Then she apologized and brought me a piece of pie. And then she told me about the electric bill. And then she told me about the Halverson family and what happened to their property on the South Ridge. And then the cook came out from the kitchen and sat down and told me about his brother-in-law's business license that got revoked for no reason right after he filed a complaint against Caldwell Construction. Clara was holding her coffee cup with both hands, and she realized she couldn't feel the warmth of it anymore. And how long were you in the diner? She said. About 2 hours, Ethan said. She looked at him. You sat in a diner for 2 hours, she said slowly. And 3 people told you things about the Caldwells that nobody in this town has said out loud in years. 4 people, Ethan said. The man at the gas station on my way back said something too, though that one was less specific. Clara put her coffee cup down. She leaned both hands on the counter. She looked at Ethan Walker and she tried to understand what she was looking at this man who had arrived in her town with a boundary dispute and a worn jacket, who was sitting across her counter talking about Dorothy's electric bill and the Halversons' South Ridge property like he was reading items off a grocery list. Why? She asked. Why what? Why are you doing this? You have a ranch. You have property. You have a life somewhere else. The Caldwells haven't done anything to you." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "They haven't done anything to me yet," he said. "But I drove through this town yesterday, and I walked into this post office, and I saw—" He stopped. He started again more carefully. "I grew up watching a man do to my mother what I believe has been done to you. And there were people around who saw it and said nothing. And I made a decision a very long time ago about what kind of man I was going to be when I saw something I shouldn't look away from." The silence between them was different now. Not the silence of withheld things. Something else. Something that had more air in it. You don't know what you saw," Clara said. Her voice was quieter than she intended. "Maybe not," Ethan agreed. "But I know what I'm looking at right now. I'm looking at a woman who knows exactly how much danger she's in and who has been trying to manage it alone for a very long time." He met her eyes. "Am I wrong?" She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she said, "The Caldwells were here yesterday evening. Someone they knew you'd come in." Ethan didn't look surprised. "Marcus?" he asked. Clara's silence was its own answer. "He came to your house." She didn't confirm it or deny it. She looked at the window, at the morning outside, at the ordinary day that was moving on without caring what was happening in this building. "You need to be careful," she said. "Not for my sake, for your own. They will not warn you twice." "I appreciate that," Ethan said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said. "I'm going to go walk around town for a while. Is there anything you need from Millie's Hardware while I'm passing by?" Clara stared at him. "I'm sorry." "Hardware store, Millie's. I pass it on the way to I'm going to walk that direction anyway. If you need anything." The absolute normalcy of the question. The sheer grounded ordinariness of it. Standing in the middle of everything she'd just told him and asking if she needed anything from the hardware store. Something moved in Clara's chest that she didn't have a name for. "I'm fine," she said. "All right." Ethan picked up his coffee cup. He straightened. "I'll stop back this afternoon, if that's all right." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "That's not why I asked." He turned and walked to the door. The bell rang. He paused with his hand on the door frame. "Clara," he said without turning around. What he's done to you, it's not because of anything you are. And it's not because of anything you did. And it's not because of anything you failed to do." He waited 1 beat, then 2. "I just thought it should be said out loud, since it seems like maybe nobody has." He walked out. The door closed. The bell faded. Clara stood behind the counter in the quiet post office in Willow Creek, Montana, and for the first time in 8 months, she did something she had not allowed herself to do in front of anyone, including herself. She cried. Quietly. Both hands flat on the counter. The way someone cries when they've been told the truth after a very long time of living with lies. And outside the ordinary day, moved on. She had herself composed by 9:15. She was at the certified letter drawer when the door opened again and she looked up expecting a customer and found herself looking at Dr. Ruth Caldwell. Not a Caldwell by blood, by marriage. Richard Caldwell's wife. Ruth Caldwell was 54 years old and had been in Willow Creek for 22 years and had the particular specific silence of a woman who has learned to live inside a house she can't leave. Clara knew that silence because she recognized it the way animals recognize weather before it arrives. Ruth rarely came into the post office. She had her mail delivered. When she did come in, she was always immaculate hair-clothes posture, in the way of a woman who treats her exterior as the only thing she still controls. Today was no different. "Good morning, Clara," Ruth said. "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," Clara said. Her voice was completely steady. Ruth set her purse on the counter. She opened it and took out a small padded envelope. "I need to send this certified with signature required," Ruth said. "Of course." Clara took the envelope and began processing it. She noted the address, a law firm in Missoula she didn't recognize. She did not comment on the address. She stamped and processed. She printed the receipt. She handed the envelope back to Ruth for her to verify the address label, as was standard procedure. Ruth looked at it. Her hands, Clara noticed, were very still. Too still. The specific stillness of someone working very hard at stillness. "Ruth," Clara said quietly. Ruth looked up. Clara held her gaze for a second. Just a second. Just long enough. "This will go out in today's afternoon pickup," Clara said. "It will be in Missoula by Thursday. Signature required means I'll have a confirmation here Friday morning." Ruth looked at her. Something moved across Ruth Caldwell's face. Something beneath the immaculate surface fast, like a fish under ice. "Thank you, Clara," she said. "Of course," Clara said. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" "No," Ruth said. She picked up her purse. She turned. She stopped. "Clara," she said with her back still turned. "Be careful of that rancher." The words were gentle, not threatening. Careful, the word itself, the one she chose. "He seems like a decent man," Ruth said, still not turning. "And decent men in this town, they don't just be careful." She walked out. The bell rang. Clara stood behind the counter. She looked at the certified envelope receipt. Missoula. A law firm. Ruth Caldwell had sent a certified letter requiring signature to a law firm in Missoula. Clara's hands held the receipt paper very carefully. She thought about Ethan Walker sitting in the diner for 2 hours, and Dorothy crying, and the cook from the kitchen, and 4 people in one evening telling a stranger the things they hadn't told each other in years. She thought about Ethan saying fear changes when people stop feeling alone in it. She thought about Ruth Caldwell's hands. Too still. Working at stillness. She thought about what was inside a padded envelope sent certified mail signature required to an unfamiliar law firm in Missoula. The morning was cold and quiet and completely ordinary, and Clara Bennett stood in the middle of it and felt for the first time in 8 months something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. The very first, very fragile sense that something might be about to change. She didn't know yet how right she was, or how much worse it would get before it did, and it started that same afternoon, 40 minutes after Ruth Caldwell walked out of the post office, when the phone on Clara's counter rang, and the voice on the other end belonged to Edward Caldwell himself. Not Marcus. Not one of his men. Edward. Clara had heard Edward Caldwell's voice on the phone exactly 3 times in 8 months. Each time, something bad followed within 24 hours. She had learned to count the hours like someone counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, measuring how close the storm was. "Clara," Edward said. His voice was the kind of voice that had never needed to be raised. Men who had everything never raised their voices. They didn't have to. "I understand we had a visitor at the land office yesterday." "We have visitors at the land office regularly," Clara said. "It's a public office. This particular visitor seems to be spending a great deal of time in town for a man who only came to file a boundary survey. His back order at Millie's isn't in until Thursday," Clara said. "There's nothing unusual about a man waiting on supplies." "No," Edward said, and the pause after it was the kind of pause that was designed to be felt. "There isn't. I just want you to know, Clara, I always appreciate your cooperation. You've been a valuable part of this community. I'd hate for anything to disrupt that." "Of course," Clara said. "Good." Another pause, shorter. "Tell me, did he mention where exactly his property is on the Miller Road side?" Clara's grip on the phone tightened by a fraction. "He filed the documents with Dennis," she said. "Everything is on record. You're welcome to request public copies." The silence on Edward Caldwell's end lasted 5 full seconds. "Of course," he said finally. "You have a good afternoon, Clara." The line went dead. Clara set the phone down. She looked at the front window for a moment. Then she picked up the phone again and dialed Millie's hardware. Millie Brandt picked up on the second ring. "Millie," Clara said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Clara," Millie's voice sharpened with immediate concern. Millie Brandt was 61 years old and had been running her hardware store for 30 years and had a mind like a steel trap and a loyalty that was old-fashioned in the best sense. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Clara said. Has Edward Caldwell or anyone from his office contacted you today about a customer, a man named Ethan Walker?" The pause on Millie's end was brief, but it was there. "Bob called this morning," Millie said, "from Caldwell Properties. Asked if anyone had come in looking to make any large purchases. Land clearing equipment. That kind of thing." Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't discuss customers," Millie said. "And then I hung up." "Millie. Don't you Millie me," Millie said. "I've been hanging up on the Caldwells for 10 years. I'm good at it by now." A beat. "What's going on, Clara?" "And don't tell me nothing. I know your nothing voice, and that's not it." Clara looked at the front window again. The street outside was quiet. Ordinary. "There's a man named Ethan Walker," Clara said. "He's been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The right kind," Clara said. "Millie, if someone came to you, someone who was actually trying to do something, would you talk to them?" The silence this time was longer. Clara could hear Millie breathing slow and deliberate the way someone breathes when they're measuring something carefully. 30 years I've been in this town," Millie said finally. "You know what I've watched happen in 30 years?" "Yes," Clara said quietly. "And you're asking me if I'd talk to someone?" "Yes. Send him to the store," Millie said. "Not during business hours. Tell him to come around back at 5:30. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Something tectonic slow-moving the way ground shifts before you hear the sound of it. "Thank you, Millie." "Don't thank me yet," Millie said. "Just make sure he's someone worth talking to." She hung up. Clara stood behind the counter in the quiet post office, and she realized her hands had stopped shaking. Not because she was less afraid. She was more afraid. More afraid than she'd been that morning. More afraid than she'd been when Edward Caldwell called. More afraid than she'd been in several weeks. But it was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of something moving, instead of the fear of being perfectly still. She wasn't sure yet which one was more dangerous. She found out when Ethan Walker came back at 3:15. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. The post office was still open. He came through the door with mud on his boots from wherever he'd been walking, and a look on his face that Clara had not seen there before. Not worried. Something more controlled than worry. "What happened?" she asked before he reached the counter. He looked at her. "You first." "Edward Caldwell called me," Clara said. "This morning, an hour after you left." Ethan said nothing, but something moved behind his eyes. "He was asking about your property," Clara said. "Where exactly on Miller Road?" He made it sound like casual conversation. "It wasn't," Ethan said. "No, it wasn't." Clara pressed her palms flat on the counter. "Now you." "I took a walk past the South Ridge this morning," Ethan said. "Out to the old Halverson property. The cook at the diner mentioned it last night, said the Halversons lost the land in a property dispute 3 years ago. I wanted to see what was on it now." "And Caldwell Construction Equipment," Ethan said. 3 pieces of it. Sitting on land that, according to the county survey records I filed yesterday, runs right up against a parcel that belongs to a trust I've been looking into." He set his hat on the counter. "The land that the Halversons lost wasn't lost in a fair dispute, Clara. The survey records were altered. I can see it in the boundary markers. They've been moved. Recently. Within the last 2 years. Clara stared at him. "You know that from looking at boundary markers." "I've spent 12 years managing property in these hills," Ethan said. "I know what a moved marker looks like. And I know what the original survey line would have been, because the 1987 document you pulled for me yesterday covers parcels that run adjacent to the Halverson land." He leaned forward slightly. "The Halversons didn't lose that land because of a legitimate dispute. They lost it because someone changed the records." The word "someone" sat between them in the quiet afternoon air. "Ethan," Clara said carefully, "if you're saying what I think you're saying." "Dennis Pratt has been in that office for 11 years, Ethan said. "And I don't think Dennis Pratt has the spine for it. Which means whoever altered those records had access to the archive, knew how the county filing system worked, and had enough influence that nobody asked questions afterward." Clara thought about Dennis Pratt. His deliberate manner. His love of process. his specific careful attention to paperwork. She thought about the times she'd found misfiled documents in the archive room. Documents in wrong years, wrong categories. She'd always assumed it was Dennis's disorganization. She had never not once considered it might be intentional. The Halvorsons moved away, Clara said almost to herself. Their son Jimmy, he tried to fight it. He talked to Sheriff Hayes. He talked to the county clerk. He came to me. She stopped. He came to you, Ethan said quietly. He came to the post office. He wanted to look through the records himself. He had the right to do that. They're public documents. She paused. I helped him pull several files. He spent about 3 hours in the archive room. And then the next week, Edward Caldwell came to see me personally and told me that my cooperation with public records requests needed to be more carefully managed. The look on Ethan's face was very still. And what happened to Jimmy Halvorson? He asked. He left town 2 weeks later, Clara said. His truck broke down on the highway 40 miles east of here. When he came back into town to use the phone, Marcus and 2 others were waiting. Nothing happened. They just talked to him. And Jimmy went back to his truck and drove north, and nobody's heard from him since. Ethan picked up his hat from the counter. He held it the same way he'd held it the first morning, turned slowly between his hands. Thinking. I need to go talk to Millie Brandt, he said. Clara's head came up. How do you know Millie? I stopped in this morning for bolts, Ethan said. She was looking at me the way someone looks when they want to say something and can't decide if the timing is right. He met Clara's eyes. Was that you? Did you call her? Clara looked at him. 5:30, she said. Around back. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. The same honest, unperformed shift she'd seen the morning before. All right, he said. He started to turn. Ethan. He turned back. Be careful between here and there, Clara said. Don't go past the Caldwell Supply Building. There's a shorter route down 4th left on Birch cuts you right to Millie's back lot. He looked at her. You know where they watch, he said. Not a question. I know everything they watch, Clara said. I've been navigating it for 8 months. The way he looked at her in that moment, it wasn't pity. It wasn't admiration. It was something simpler and more complete than either of those things. It was recognition. 4th and Birch, he said. 4th and Birch, Clara confirmed. He left. The bell rang and faded, and Clara stood in the quiet, and for the first time since Edward Caldwell's call that morning, she breathed all the way to the bottom of her lungs. She didn't know what Millie would say. She didn't know what Ethan would find. She didn't know what was in the padded envelope Ruth Caldwell had sent to a law firm in Missoula, or whether it meant what her instincts told her it meant. She knew one thing. She knew that this morning she had been one woman alone, navigating a system designed to erase her. And this afternoon, without anyone announcing it, without any formal decision being made, without any speech or plan or dramatic declaration, something had started to gather. It was small. It was fragile. It could be stopped. But it was real. And Clara Bennett, who had spent 8 months being very, very still, felt it move through her like the first current of warm air before a season changes. She was still afraid. But she wasn't alone in it anymore. And that, as Ethan Walker had told her that morning, was exactly where everything begins. The afternoon moved forward. The clock on the post office wall ticked. Clara sorted letters she didn't see, stamped packages she barely felt, and kept her face level and her hands steady. She was performing the same role she performed every day. She was doing it as perfectly as she ever had. But something underneath it had shifted. At 4:45, the door opened. It was Tom Greer, who ran the gas station on Route 9, and who had lived in Willow Creek for 40 years, and who until this moment had never once come into the post office during Clara's afternoon hours. He always sent his daughter in the mornings. Tom, Clara said, is everything all right? Tom Greer was 67 years old, and had the careful, watchful stillness of a man who had learned very early that keeping his head down was how you kept your head. He came to the counter. He set down a small padded envelope, similar in size to the one Ruth Caldwell had sent that morning, though Clara told herself that was coincidence, that padded envelopes were padded envelopes. Need to send this certified, Tom said. Signature required. Of course, Clara said. She processed it without looking at the address label until it was her job to verify it. Missoula. A different law firm, but Missoula. Her hands moved through the processing steps automatically. She handed the verification back to Tom. He looked at her. That rancher, Tom said low and direct. The one who stopped for gas yesterday morning. He asked me how I was doing. Clara said nothing. Nobody around here asks me that, Tom said. Not the way he did, like he actually wanted to know. He paused. I told him about my brother-in-law, about the business license. I know, Clara said quietly. I've been wanting to do something for 3 years, Tom said. I didn't know what. I didn't know if there was anything. I didn't know if there was anyone. He met her eyes. Is there someone now? Clara looked at Tom Greer, 67 years old. 40 years in this town, a man who had kept his head down so long, it had become a habit he'd mistaken for a choice. I think so, she said. I think there might be. Tom nodded once. The way men of a certain age and experience nod when they've made a decision that took a long time to arrive at and isn't going back. Tell him, Tom said, that I have 3 years of receipts, the discrepancies in the lease rates, all of it, in a folder in my office safe. He turned and walked to the door. Tom, Clara said. He paused. Thank you, she said. He didn't look back. But his shoulders as he pushed through the door were slightly straighter than they'd been when he came in. Clara stood at the counter for a long moment after the bell faded. 2 certified letters. One morning, one afternoon. Both Missoula. Both sent by people who had until today been as silent as the town itself. She thought about what Ethan had said. People will tell you things when they trust that you're not going to use them. She thought about the way it spreads. The way one person asking the right question in the right tone can open something that everyone had agreed to keep closed. She thought about how fragile it was. She thought about how Edward Caldwell had called that morning. And she understood with perfect clarity that the Caldwells were already paying attention. They'd felt something shift too. They didn't know what it was or how far it had gone, but Edward Caldwell had not called her personally in 3 months, and he had called today, and that was not coincidence. They were watching. And watching meant they were worried. And worried men with power were the most dangerous kind. She was still holding that thought when the phone rang again. She picked it up. Post office, she said. Clara. The voice was not Edward's, not Marcus's. It was a woman's voice, and it took Clara 3 full seconds to place it, because she had not spoken to this woman directly in over a year. Margaret Hayes, the sheriff's wife. Margaret, Clara said carefully, I need to talk to you. Margaret Hayes's voice was low and controlled in the specific way of someone having a conversation they couldn't let be overheard. Not on this phone. When do you close today? 5 o'clock, Clara said. Can you walk past the park on your way home, the bench by the old cottonwood? 6 o'clock. Clara's heart was beating quickly and evenly like it always did when something important was happening that she wasn't ready for. I usually go straight home, Clara said. I know. Margaret paused. Please, Clara. I don't have anyone else to ask. 6 words. The same 6 words in a different arrangement that Clara herself had been living for 8 months. I don't have anyone else to ask. The specific loneliness of a woman in a small town where every relationship is owned by someone else's power. 6 o'clock, Clara said. By the cottonwood. She hung up. She stood in the quiet post office, and for the first time she let herself count. Ruth Caldwell. Tom Greer. Margaret Hayes. 3 people. 1 day. A certified letter to Missoula. 3 years of receipts in a safe. A sheriff's wife who needed someone to talk to. It was more than she'd had in 8 months. It was more than she'd had maybe in years. It was also potentially a trap. She was clear-eyed enough to hold both things at once. The hope and the danger of it. In Willow Creek, those 2 things were never far apart. She locked up at 5 and walked to the park. Margaret Hayes was already there when Clara arrived. She was sitting on the bench by the old cottonwood with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked smaller than Clara remembered her. Margaret was 52, 10 years older than Clara, and she'd been the sheriff's wife for 23 years, and she'd worn that position the way women of her generation wore difficult things with dignity and without complaint, and with a very particular kind of exhaustion that only showed in the eyes. Her eyes were exhausted now. "Margaret," Clara said. She sat down beside her. "I don't know where to start," Margaret said. "Start anywhere," Clara said. "We have time." Margaret looked at her hands. I've known for a long time that Frank wasn't making his own choices anymore," she said. "About the department, about how things got handled. I knew when the Halversons came to him and he sent them away. I knew when he told me it wasn't his business. I knew, Clara. I'm not a fool." Her voice cracked slightly. She controlled it. "But knowing and doing something about it are different things. Especially when you live with someone. Especially when you've built a life." "I know," Clara said quietly. "This morning Frank got a call from Edward Caldwell." Margaret looked up. "After the call, Frank told me there was a man in town who was going to cause trouble and that it was going to need to be handled." Clara's hands were very still in her lap. "What kind of handling?" she asked. "He didn't say specifically. He never says specifically." Margaret's jaw tightened. "But I've been watching Frank not say things specifically for long enough to understand what they mean. They're going to try to run that rancher out. And if he doesn't go—" She stopped. "Margaret, Frank has a file," Margaret said. "In his desk at home. He's been keeping a file because I think he's been scared too. I think he started doing what the Caldwells asked because he thought it was easier, and then he realized he'd gone too far and there was no way back, and so he started keeping a record of what they asked him to do. Insurance. In case they ever—" She breathed in. "I've read it. Last month when he was out. I found it and I read it." Clara felt the world get very quiet around her. "What's in it?" she said. Margaret looked at her. "Everything," Margaret said. "Frank's notes, dates, specific instructions, names, what he was told to do about the Halversons, what he was told to do about Jimmy when Jimmy tried to fight back, what he was told to do about—" She stopped. She looked away. "About you, last spring, when you tried to talk to him." Clara stopped breathing for a moment. She remembered last spring. She remembered sitting in the sheriff's office. She remembered Frank Hayes's face, which had been carefully blank the entire time she spoke, and how he had told her there was nothing he could do without more substantial evidence, and how she had walked out of that office and gone straight to the post office bathroom and sat on the floor with her back against the wall for 20 minutes. "He has notes," Clara said. Her voice was very controlled. "About what happened to me." "About what Marcus did," Margaret said. "And about what Edward told Frank to do about it, which was nothing." She looked back at Clara. "I'm sorry. I've been sorry since last spring. I didn't know Frank didn't tell me until later, and by then—" She shook her head. "I don't have an excuse. I had choices, and I made the wrong ones." Silence moved between them like wind. Clara looked at the old cottonwood tree. She looked at its bark, how thick it was, how many years it had taken to get that way. "Can you get the file?" Clara asked. Margaret's breath came out all at once like she'd been holding it since she'd called that afternoon. "That's why I asked you here," she said. "I can get the file, but I need to know what to do with it. I don't know who to trust. The county judge is—" "Owned," Clara said simply. "Yes." "The county attorney donated heavily to his last campaign," Margaret said. "Yes." Clara thought for a moment. "There's a law firm in Missoula." She stopped herself. She thought about Ruth Caldwell's padded envelope. She thought about Tom Greer's certified letter. She thought about the fact that she didn't know those law firms didn't know if they were connected, didn't know if this was something that had already started being organized by people who'd been preparing longer than today. She thought about Ethan Walker at Millie's Hardware right now at 5:30 around the back. "I need to talk to someone first," Clara said. "Can you give me until tomorrow morning? Can you keep the file safe until then?" "It's been safe for 3 years," Margaret said with a particular sad kind of irony. "One more night won't hurt." Tomorrow morning, Clara said. 7:30, before I open. Come to the back of the post office. Margaret nodded. She stood. She smoothed her coat. She was already reassembling herself, the careful reconstruction of the face she wore in public. Clara, she said. Yes. That rancher, Margaret said. Whatever Frank's been told to do, it's going to happen tonight, or tomorrow morning at the latest. She met Clara's eyes. He needs to know. Clara was already standing. I know, she said. She walked out of the park faster than was casual, fast enough that it probably looked like what it was. She didn't care. There were moments when the performance had to end, because the thing underneath it was more urgent than appearances, and this was one of those moments. She turned down 4th Street, left on Birch. She could see Millie's Hardware ahead, the building dark in front, a faint light around the back lot. She came around the side of the building and stopped. Ethan was there. And Millie. And Dorothy from the diner, which Clara had not expected. And Bob Chen, the cook, and 2 other people she recognized, Phil Tanner from the pharmacy, and Lena Rourke, who had been the Halversons' nearest neighbor before the family left. 6 people standing in the near dark behind Millie's Hardware, talking in the careful low voices of people doing something they'd needed to do for a long time, and had not been able to until now. They looked up when she came around the corner. Ethan saw her face. He was beside her in 4 steps. What happened, he said. They're going to move against you, Clara said. Tonight or tomorrow. Margaret Hayes just told me Frank Hayes has a file. Everything the Caldwells asked him to do. Everything. Dates, names, instructions. Ruth Caldwell sent a certified letter to a law firm in Missoula this morning. Tom Greer sent one this afternoon. And Margaret can get Frank's file by tomorrow morning. The silence behind Ethan was absolute. She hadn't meant to say all of it at once. She hadn't meant to say it in front of all of them. She hadn't meant for this to be the moment, standing in the dark behind a hardware store out of breath. Her careful composure finally cracked open. But she had said it, and it was in the air now among all of them. Millie was the first to speak. Ruth Caldwell, Millie said. Not a question. Just a woman absorbing information and reconfiguring everything she thought she knew. Yes, Clara said. His own wife, Millie said. She's been collecting evidence for years, Clara said. I think she's been waiting for the right moment, for the right person. She looked at Ethan when she said it. Ethan was looking back at her, and there was something in his expression that was very quiet, and very serious, and very sure. They're going to come for me tonight, he said. It wasn't a question either. Margaret thinks so. All right. He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without performance, like someone who had made a decision he could stand behind. Then tonight, I'm going to stay exactly where I am and be very easy to find. Ethan. I want them to come to me, he said. I want them to make a move they can't take back. Because right now, everything we have is evidence of what they've done before. If they come for me tonight, we get evidence of what they're doing right now. Clara stared at him. You're using yourself as bait, she said. I'm making myself available, he said. That's the same thing. Not quite, Ethan said, and he almost smiled. Bait doesn't know it's bait. I know exactly what I'm doing. The group behind him was listening. Clara could feel the weight of their attention, 6 people in the dark, all of them with years of fear packed into their bodies, all of them looking at a man who talked about being found by the Caldwells, like it was a step in a plan rather than the end of one. What do you need us to do? Phil Tanner asked. He was 58 and had been running the pharmacy for 20 years, and had the voice of a man who was asking because he was ready, not because he needed persuading. Ethan looked at him. I need you to write down everything, Ethan said. Every specific incident. Dates if you have them, names, what was said and by who. I need it on paper by tomorrow morning. He looked around at all of them. Not to me. Write it out and give it to Clara. They all looked at Clara. Clara stood in the cold air behind Millie's Hardware and felt the weight of it. All of it settle onto her, like something she hadn't asked for and couldn't give back and wasn't sure she wanted to. Write it out, she said. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiest it had been all day. Give it to me by 7 tomorrow morning. Come to the back. One by one they nodded. Dorothy was crying quietly, the way older women cry when relief and grief arrive together. And it's impossible to separate them. Millie put a hand on her shoulder. Ethan caught Clara's eye. "Go home," he said quietly. "Lock your door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "I'm not the one who needs protecting tonight," Clara said. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not saying it because you need protecting. I'm saying it because I need to know where you are." She looked at him. She understood with sudden and complete clarity that this man standing in front of her was not doing any of this for her. Not in the way people do things for other people when they want something in return. Not in the way people help when helping is a transaction. He was doing it because he had looked at Willow Creek and seen it clearly, and looking clearly at something wrong, and then walking away from it was not something Ethan Walker was built for. She was a part of it. But she wasn't the whole of it. And that somehow made her trust him more than anything else he had said or done. "Lock your door," he said again. "Lock yours," she said back. And for the first time in 8 months, Clara Bennett walked home through the dark streets of Willow Creek and was not performing anything for anyone. She was just a woman walking home afraid and ready, which was something entirely different from afraid and alone. Behind her in the cold dark, behind Millie's hardware, 6 people who had been silent for years were beginning quietly and carefully and with great intention to speak. And in that quiet, the specific quiet of a small town that had agreed for years to stay silent. 6 people who had been afraid long enough finally chose to be something else, and the sound of that choice, though it made no noise at all, was the loudest thing that had happened in Willow Creek in a very long time. Clara did not sleep. She lay in the dark of her bedroom, and she listened to her house the way she had learned to listen to it over the past 8 months. Every creak of the frame, every shift of wind against the windows, every car that passed on the road outside. She had become very good at identifying the difference between the ordinary sounds of an old house settling and the sounds that meant someone was outside who shouldn't be. At 11:40, she heard a truck slow in front of her house. She did not move. She lay perfectly still and counted. The truck idled for approximately 40 seconds. Then it moved on. She knew that truck. She knew the particular low rumble of its engine. It was one of the vehicles that belonged to Caldwell Properties. She had heard it outside her house before at different hours, always slow, always just long enough to be a message. She lay still until she heard it turn at the end of the road and not come back. Then she got up and sat at her kitchen table in the dark and thought about Ethan Walker sleeping or not sleeping in the room he'd rented at Agnes Whitmore's boarding house on the north side of town. And she thought about whether he had locked his door and whether that would matter if the Caldwells decided tonight was the night. At 12:15, she almost called Agnes Whitmore's number. She stopped herself. Not because she didn't want to. Because calling at 12:15 was the kind of thing that could be noticed. Phone records in a town this small had a way of becoming conversations, and conversations had a way of reaching the wrong ears, and she had not come this far by being careless at midnight. She stayed at the table until 2 in the morning. Then she went back to bed, and this time she slept, and she dreamed of nothing, which was itself a kind of mercy. She was at the post office at 6:45. She went in through the back. She turned on only the interior light, not the front window sign. She put the kettle on the small burner in the back room, and she set out the only 2 chairs that existed back there, and she waited. Dorothy was first. She arrived at 6:52 with a folder in one hand and a covered plate in the other, because Dorothy was the kind of woman who brought food to every serious occasion, which Clara had always found both touching and very specifically Dorothy. She set the plate down, biscuits still warm, and she sat down and she put the folder on the table. "I wrote everything down last night," Dorothy said. "Dates back to 2019. Every time someone from the Caldwell office came in and the bill changed. Every time I was told my lease renewal depended on my cooperation with certain things." She paused. "I wrote down the conversation I had with Edward Caldwell personally in March of last year. I remember it word for word. I've been remembering it word for word every day since." "Thank you, Dorothy," Clara said. "Don't thank me yet." Dorothy said exactly the way Millie had said it the day before, and Clara felt something almost like a smile move through her. Phil Tanner came at 7. Then Lena Rourke, who had driven 40 minutes in the dark from the house she'd moved to after the Halversons left, and the neighborhood changed because she had nowhere else to be that mattered more than this. Then Bob Chen, the cook, with a folded piece of paper that turned out to be 4 pages long when Clara opened it, 4 pages of careful small handwriting that went back 5 years. Tom Greer came at 7:10. He set a folder on the table that was 2 inches thick. 3 years, he said. Every receipt, every lease irregularity, every conversation with Bob Caldwell about my rates. He looked at Clara steadily. My brother-in-law lost his business. He moved to Billings. He has 2 kids. He put his hand flat on the folder. Every piece of paper in here is accurate and documented. Clara looked at the table, at the folders and the papers and the people sitting around them drinking coffee from the mugs she'd brought from the cabinet, eating Dorothy's biscuits, speaking in the careful low voices of people conducting something serious and real. It was 7:15 in the morning. She had known these people for years. She had sorted their mail and processed their packages and said good morning and asked after their children and their health. She had existed alongside them in the particular parallel track way of a small town where you know everyone and nobody knows you, not really, not the way that matters. And in the space of less than 24 hours, without anyone planning it, without any announcement or organization or formal decision, they had become something. She didn't have a word for it yet. At 7:20, Margaret Hayes knocked on the back door. Clara opened it. Margaret was wearing her coat, and her hair was done, and she looked like she had also not slept, but she had done it in the composed, contained way of a woman with 23 years of practice at presenting herself correctly, regardless of what the night had been. She was carrying a manila envelope. She held it out to Clara without speaking. Clara took it. It was heavier than it looked. She could feel through the envelope the slight texture of many sheets of paper, some of them thicker photographs maybe, printed records. Frank doesn't know I've done this, Margaret said. I know, Clara said. Frank isn't a bad man, Margaret said, and her voice was very even, but something moved behind her eyes that Clara recognized as the particular pain of a person defending someone they love who has done something indefensible. He made choices. He kept making them because the first one was too hard to take back. I've watched that happen for years, and She stopped. Margaret, Clara said. I know it doesn't make it right, Margaret said quickly. I'm not saying it makes it right. I know you're not, Clara said. Margaret looked at the envelope in Clara's hands. Everything in there, she said, is in Frank's handwriting. Dates, names, specific instructions. What he was asked to do, and by who and when, and what happened afterward. She looked up. There's a section in the back. About you, Clara. About what Marcus did. About what Edward told Frank to do about it. The room behind Clara had gone completely quiet. She was aware of Dorothy and Phil and Lena and Bob and Tom behind her. All of them hearing this. All of them understanding in real time what was in the envelope and what it meant. I added something of my own to the back, Margaret said quietly. A signed statement about what Frank told me, about what I knew and when I knew it. She looked Clara directly in the eye. I'm not protecting Frank from the consequences of what he's done. Whatever happens to him because of that envelope, I understand. I've been sitting with that understanding since I read his file. Clara held the envelope against her chest for a moment. Is Frank home right now? She asked. He left at 6:30, Margaret said. He told me he had early business. He didn't say what kind. Clara and Margaret looked at each other and shared the specific understanding of 2 women who knew exactly what early business meant. Go home, Clara said. Go about your normal morning. Don't call Frank. If he calls you, answer normally. Can you do that? I've been doing that for 3 years, Margaret said. There was no bitterness in it. Just the flat accuracy of a statement of fact. She turned and walked away from the back door. Clara closed it. She turned around. Everyone was looking at her. Ethan needs to see all of this, Clara said. Right now, before Frank Hayes does whatever Edward Caldwell sent him to do this morning. I'll go, Millie said. She had come in quietly sometime in the last few minutes. Clara hadn't heard her arrive, which meant she'd been there for a while. No, Clara said. I'll go. She looked at the room of people. Stay here, she said. Keep the back door locked. Don't open the front until 9. If anyone comes, anyone at all, you're here because I needed help with a filing issue, and you're waiting for me to get back. She picked up the stack of folders and the manila envelope. She looked at it all 3 years and 5 years and 8 months of what had been done to this town, to these people, to her, all of it in paper form, solid and real and documentable. I'll be back, she said. She went out the back door. The walk to Agnes Whitmore's boarding house was 6 minutes on the direct route. Clara took the route through 4th and Birch, the same route she'd told Ethan to use, and she moved quickly and did not look around in the way that would signal that she was checking whether she was being watched. She was absolutely being watched. She simply didn't want to confirm it. Agnes Whitmore answered the boarding house door in her housecoat, which meant it was before 8, and Agnes had not yet transitioned into her daytime self. Clara Bennett. Agnes said, not with surprise, but with the specific resignation of a woman who has been in a small town long enough that nothing genuinely surprises her anymore. Is Mr. Walker in? Clara said. He's at breakfast, Agnes said, already stepping back to let her through. Back room. Clara went through the narrow front hallway and into the small room at the back that served as the dining area for Agnes's guests. There was one table. Ethan was sitting at it with a cup of coffee and a newspaper he clearly wasn't reading because he put it face down the moment she came through the door and stood up. He took one look at her face and then at what she was carrying. Sit down, he said, and he meant it as an invitation, not an instruction. And Clara sat down and put everything on the table between them. Frank Hayes was sent out this morning, she said. Before 6:30, we don't know where. She slid the manila envelope across the table. Margaret brought this morning. Frank's file. Everything he was told to do by the Caldwells over 3 years in his own handwriting with a signed statement from Margaret in the back. Ethan opened the envelope. He looked at the first page for 30 seconds. His face was very still. This is Frank's handwriting, he said. Margaret confirmed it. She's lived with that handwriting for 23 years. He turned to the next page, then the next. Clara watched his face and saw the specific quality of stillness that appears on a person's face when they are reading something they expected to be bad and have found it is worse. There's a section near the back, Clara said quietly. He found it. He read it. His jaw tightened, just once, just slightly. And then he was still again, but it was a different stillness. The kind that comes after something moves through a person and leaves them changed. He closed the envelope. The others, he said. Clara slid the folders across. He went through them quickly, not reading every word, reading the way someone reads when they're looking for the structure of something, the shape of it, what kind of evidence it is, and how it holds together. This is enough, he said. Clara looked at him. Enough for what? Enough that a state attorney's office would have to open an investigation, Ethan said. Property fraud, coercion, obstruction of justice. This. He touched the manila envelope. This alone is grounds for Frank Hayes's immediate removal and criminal investigation. The property records, that's a felony. The documented coercion of businesses, that's organized extortion. He looked up. And this has nothing to do with what they did to you, which is a separate criminal matter entirely. Clara looked at the folders on the table. She had known in an abstract way that what the Caldwells had done was wrong and illegal. You didn't have to be a lawyer to know that. But hearing it listed property fraud, coercion, obstruction, extortion. Each word, a specific legal category, a charge with a name and a process behind it, made it real in a way that abstract knowing never had. The law firm in Missoula, Clara said. Ruth sent a certified letter yesterday morning. I don't know what's in it. Ethan looked at her steadily. I think I do, he said. You know about Ruth. I've been making some calls, Ethan said. Last night after I came back from Millie's. I know someone in Missoula, an attorney I dealt with when I bought my ranch. He knows the legal community there. I described the situation, generally no names, and he gave me the names of 2 firms that handle exactly this kind of rural corruption case. He paused. One of them is called Whitfield and Associates. Clara thought of Ruth Caldwell's envelope. She hadn't looked at the firm name closely. She had seen Missoula and processed the significance of that, and then moved on. She tried to reconstruct the label in her memory. The font, the first letter. "I think that's it," she said. "The name on the envelope. I think that was it." Ethan's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled the way the last piece of a complicated mechanism settles into place when everything is finally correctly aligned. "Ruth Caldwell has been preparing this," he said. "Not for days, not for weeks. She said yesterday morning when she came in." Clara stopped. She looked at Ethan. "How did you know Ruth came in yesterday morning?" she said. "I didn't tell you that." Ethan held her gaze. "Ruth called me last night," he said. The room was very quiet. "She called you," Clara repeated. "At 9:30, at Agnes's. She got the number from the boarding house directory. Agnes keeps one for guests." He put his hands flat on the table. "Ruth has been building a case against her husband for 4 years. Financial records, property documents she copied before they were filed, correspondence she kept, photographs of altered boundary markers." He paused. "She sent the first package to Whitfield and Associates 18 months ago. She's been sending material incrementally ever since, so that if anything happened to her, Whitfield already had most of it. Last night she told me she sent the final piece yesterday morning." Clara stared at him. "The padded envelope," she said. "The padded envelope," Ethan confirmed. "She's been building this case for 4 years," Clara said, and she heard her own voice say it, and it landed on her like something physical. The weight of 4 years of Ruth Caldwell in that house, in that life, collecting pieces of evidence one at a time, like a woman building a wall stone by stone in secret. "She contacted Whitfield and Associates last night also," Ethan said. "Formally, with everything in place, and she told them about Frank Hayes's file." "She knew about Frank's file. She didn't know about the file specifically," Ethan said. "But she knew Frank had been keeping records. She told me she'd suspected it for 2 years, that Frank was covering himself the same way people in that position always do. She told Whitfield that a witness had come forward with documentation of Frank Hayes's instructions from the Caldwell family." Clara pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them. Outside the boarding house, somewhere in the ordinary morning of Willow Creek, Frank Hayes was running an errand for Edward Caldwell, the same man whose wife had spent 4 years building the case that would end him. In a law firm in Missoula, an attorney who specialized in exactly this kind of case was sitting with a complete package of documented evidence assembled over 4 years by a woman living inside the thing she was dismantling. And in this small back room on a Tuesday morning in October, the whole structure of what the Caldwells had built was sitting on a table in manila envelopes and file folders, documented and signed and real. "Why did Ruth wait?" Clara said. "If she had all of this, why didn't she go to Whitfield 18 months ago with everything?" "Because 18 months ago," Ethan said carefully, "she didn't have what she has now." "Which is?" "A witness," Ethan said. "Whitfield told her that financial documents and property records are strong evidence, but that in a case like this, a family with this much local control, you need human testimony. People who can stand up and say what happened to them. Not just paper." He looked at her directly. "Ruth needed to know that people were ready to speak. She's been waiting for that." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "She came into my post office yesterday morning," Clara said slowly. "She sent her letter certified signature required, and then she told me to be careful of you." "She told you to be careful of me," Ethan said. Not defensively, just precisely. "She said you seemed like a decent man," Clara said, "and that decent men in this town don't—" She stopped. "She was warning you," Ethan said, "in case I turned out to be someone who would take what you told me and use it for the wrong reasons. She was protecting you even then." Clara thought about Ruth Caldwell's hands on the counter. Too still. The particular stillness of someone working very hard at stillness, because underneath the stillness, something enormous and long prepared was finally in motion. "She knew I would tell you things," Clara said. "She hoped you would," Ethan said. "She called me last night and she told me she'd come into the post office specifically because she'd heard I was in town and she wanted to see what kind of man I was. She said the way you looked at me when you came around the counter to the archive room told her something." Clara felt heat move into her face, which she was not accustomed to and did not welcome. She made a judgment about a stranger based on the way I looked at him, she said. She made a judgment about a stranger, Ethan said quietly, based on the fact that you were willing to look at him at all. The silence between them was warm and complicated, and Clara decided not to examine it too closely because there was no time, and because some things could be examined later after the immediate world had been dealt with. "What do we do with all of this?" she said, gesturing at the table. "I called my attorney in Missoula last night," Ethan said. "He's already been in contact with Whitfield. They're expecting a full package by end of business today. Everything we have here, plus what Ruth has already sent. My attorney is also contacting the State Attorney General's office this morning." He paused. The moment the state AG gets involved, the Caldwells can't use local law enforcement to suppress it. Frank Hayes becomes a witness instead of a shield. "The State Attorney General," Clara said. "Montana State AG's office has been watching rural corruption cases for the last 3 years, Ethan said. "This isn't the first town. It's not even the first county. There's a pattern and this—" He touched the folders. "This is the most documented version of that pattern they're going to have seen." Clara sat with this. She sat with the fact that Ethan Walker had arrived in Willow Creek 2 days ago to file a land boundary survey. She sat with the fact that within 48 hours, he had assembled a case that 4 years of Ruth Caldwell's careful collection and 3 years of Tom Greer's documented receipts and Frank Hayes' own personal insurance file had not been enough to activate on their own. Not because he was more capable than any of them, but because he was the thing they had all been missing. He was the person who had a "you all right?" and meant it. "There's something else," Ethan said. His voice shifted slightly, not a dramatic shift, but enough that Clara caught it. She looked at him. "Frank Hayes," Ethan said. "I know where he went this morning." Clara waited. "Agnes Whitmore told me at 6:30 that there was a deputy sheriff's vehicle parked on the street at the end of the block," Ethan said. "She told me because she's 71 years old, and she's lived in this town her whole life, and she is in her words sick and tired of the Caldwell family, and she has been for 20 years. He paused. "I went out the back of the boarding house at 6:45. I walked around to where the deputy's vehicle was parked. Deputy Carroll. He's 24 years old, and he was doing exactly what he looked like he was doing, which was watching to see if I left and which direction I went. Frank sent a deputy to watch you," Clara said. "Frank sent a deputy to watch me," Ethan confirmed. "Which means Frank knows enough to want to know my movements. Which means Edward told Frank enough that Frank understands this is more than a stranger with a land survey." He looked at her. "What it also means is that Frank hasn't moved yet. He's still in the watching phase, which gives us a window." "How long a window?" "Not long," Ethan said. "Once Edward realizes that Ruth has made a move, and he'll figure that out because Edward Caldwell didn't build what he has by being slow, the watching phase ends." "How will he find out about Ruth?" Ethan was quiet for one beat. "Because Ruth is going to tell him," he said. Clara stared at him. "Ruth is going to tell Edward," she said. "This morning," Ethan said, "at 9 o'clock. She's going to sit down with her husband and she's going to tell him that she has sent a complete documentation of his criminal activity to Whitfield and Associates in Missoula, that a copy is going to the State Attorney General's office this afternoon, and that she has been interviewed by Whitfield as a cooperating witness." "She's going to tell him herself," Clara said slowly. "She told me last night that she has been afraid of that man for 22 years, Ethan said. And she told me that she wanted the last thing she was ever afraid of him for to be a choice she made herself. Not something he found out. Not something that blindsided them both. She wanted to look him in the face and tell him that she had done it." Clara felt something move through her that she didn't have a word for. She thought about Ruth Caldwell at 9 o'clock this morning, sitting across from Richard Caldwell, immaculate and contained, and 4 years of evidence already in Missoula saying, "I did this. I chose this." She thought about what kind of courage that required. The specific, particular, rarely celebrated courage of a woman who has survived by staying still for a very long time, and then, when the moment is exactly right, moves. "When Edward finds out," Clara said. "When Edward finds out." Ethan said, "The Caldwells are going to do one of two things. They're going to run or they're going to fight. And if they fight, they're going to come at every person in this town who they know has spoken. Which means Dorothy and Tom and Millie and Phil and Lena and Margaret. And me, Clara said. And you, Ethan said. He looked at her directly. I need to ask you something. Clara and I need you to answer it honestly. All right, she said. Is there anything the Caldwells have on you? He said. Anything they could use. Anything that any agreement you made with them that they could hold up and say you violated. Any document you signed. Anything Marcus could claim you. No, Clara said. Her voice was flat and clear. There's nothing. There was never any agreement. There was only fear. And there's nothing they can produce that makes what Marcus did look like anything other than what it was. Ethan held her gaze for a moment. Good, he said. He stood. He gathered the folders and the envelope with the careful hands of a man who understood he was holding something that mattered. I need to get these copies made, he said. And I need to courier the originals to Missoula by this afternoon. He looked at Clara. I need you to go back to the post office and open it normally. Perfectly normally. Nothing different about today. And if Frank Hayes comes in, be exactly as you always are with him, Ethan said. And if Edward Caldwell calls, answer it, Ethan said. Tell him the rancher seems to be leaving Thursday as planned. Tell him everything looks normal. Clara looked at him. You want me to lie to Edward Caldwell, she said. I want you to tell him the truth, Ethan said. I am planning to leave Thursday. I just have a few things to do between now and then. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Clara, he said. She stood. I was looking at her the way he'd looked at her that first morning, that direct, unhurried, non-intrusive looking. Except that it had been 2 days, and they were not the same two people they'd been in that first morning. Something had happened in the space between those 2 moments, something that had no good name, but was real and solid. Whatever happens today, he said, you should know that what you did this morning bringing those people in, holding that space for them being the person they could come to, that wasn't nothing. That was everything. Clara looked at him. You're the one who asked them if they were all right, she said. I asked, he said. You made it safe for them to answer. She held his gaze for one long moment. Then she picked up her coat and she walked out of Agnes Whitmore's boarding house and turned toward the post office, moving through the ordinary morning of Willow Creek, like a woman who had nowhere particular to be and nothing particular on her mind. She was, if anyone was watching, completely calm. Inside, she was counting. 9 o'clock, Ruth Caldwell would sit down across from her husband. This afternoon, a courier would leave for Missoula with everything they had. Tonight or tomorrow, at the latest, Edward Caldwell would know. And when that happened, when the man who had controlled this town for 30 years understood that it was ending, that the walls were already down, even if he couldn't see it yet, the question was not whether he would fight back. The question was whether they would all still be standing when he did. Clara opened the back door of the post office. She hung up her coat. She turned on the lights. She walked to the front, turned the sign to open, and stood behind her counter. 8:57 in the morning. 3 minutes until Ruth Caldwell looked her husband in the face and told him the truth. Clara straightened the certified letter forms. She aligned the stamp pad. She put her hands flat on the counter and felt the solid wood of it under her palms. She was ready, and the first test of that readiness came at 9:14, not 9 o'clock, because Ruth Caldwell had apparently taken 17 minutes longer than planned to say the thing she had been preparing to say for 4 years. And Clara knew the exact moment it happened, because at 9:14 the phone on her counter rang, and the number on the display was one she had never seen before. And when she answered it, the voice on the other end was Ruth Caldwell's, and it was the calmest voice Clara had ever heard on a human being in her life. I told him, Ruth said. Clara gripped the phone. Are you safe? I'm at the Whitmore house, Ruth said. Agnes let me in. Ethan is here. A pause, barely a second. Richard didn't. He didn't touch me. He went very quiet, and then he made a phone call and I left. Another pause. He called Edward. How long ago? 8 minutes, Ruth said. I drove directly here. Clara's eyes went to the front window. The street outside looked exactly as it always did at 9 in the morning. Ordinary. Unhurried. A town going about its Tuesday business. "Stay at Agnes's," Clara said. "Don't open the door for anyone but me or Ethan." "Clara." Ruth's voice shifted just slightly. "There's something I didn't tell Ethan yet. Something I found 2 weeks ago that I didn't put in the package to Whitfield because I needed to verify it first." Clara's hand tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "The post office," Ruth said. "This building. The land it sits on." Clara went completely still. "The deed," Ruth said, "was transferred 18 months ago. I found a copy in Richard's study. The land your post office sits on, the building itself, was quietly transferred from county property to a Caldwell Holdings shell company. The county commissioners signed off on it at a meeting that was never publicly announced." Clara stared at the counter in front of her. The counter she had stood behind for 11 years. "They own this building," Clara said. "They have owned it for 18 months, Ruth said. "And I think, Clara, I think the reason Marcus targeted you specifically, the reason Edward called you, and not anyone else when Ethan arrived, I think they were always planning to use the building as leverage. If you ever became a problem, they could simply terminate the lease and remove you." Clara heard her own breathing. She thought about Edward Caldwell's phone call yesterday. The careful, warm, nearly paternal tone of it. "I always appreciate your cooperation. I'd hate for anything to disrupt that. Not a threat about Marcus. Not a threat about what had been done to her. A threat about this building, this counter, this job she had held for 11 years, which was the only stable thing she had managed to keep in 8 months of managed fear." "How quickly can you send that document to Whitfield?" Clara said. "I have a photograph of it on my phone," Ruth said. "I can send it in the next 5 minutes." "Send it now," Clara said. "Send it to Ethan too. He needs to know before he sends the courier package." "All right." A breath. "Clara, I'm sorry. About the building. I should have told you sooner." "You're telling me now," Clara said. "That's what matters. Send the photograph." She hung up. She stood behind the counter of the post office that belonged on paper to a Caldwell shell company, and she breathed slow and deliberate 4 counts in and 4 counts out. The way she'd taught herself to breathe when things accelerated beyond what she'd planned for. Then she picked up the phone and called Ethan. He answered on the first ring. "I know," he said. "Ruth just showed me." "Does it change anything?" "It adds a count of fraudulent property transfer and undisclosed conflict of interest for the county commissioners who signed off," Ethan said. His voice was the same voice he always used. Same steadiness. Completely unshaken. "The courier leaves at noon. This goes in the package." "Edward knows," Clara said. "Richard called him 8 minutes ago, probably 9 by now." "I know," Ethan said again. "I'm already moving." "Moving where?" "I need to talk to Dennis Pratt," Ethan said. Clara's breath caught. "Dennis," she said. "Ethan, Dennis is, I don't know where Dennis stands. If Edward gets to him first." "Edward won't get to him first," Ethan said. "Because Dennis called me this morning, at 7:45. He left a message with Agnes." Another silence. Another peace landing that Clara hadn't seen coming. "Dennis called you," she said. "He said he needed to talk to me about the 1987 survey document," Ethan said. "That there was something about it he hadn't mentioned. Something he'd been sitting on for 2 years. Dennis Pratt. Slow, deliberate, process-obsessed Dennis Pratt, who Clara had always assumed was either complicit or oblivious. Who had apparently been sitting on something for 2 years. "Go," Clara said. "Go talk to Dennis. I'll hold here. Keep the front window visible," Ethan said. "If anything changes, anything at all, call Agnes's number." "Ethan." "Yes." "Be careful," she said. Not the way she'd said it before, as a warning about the Caldwells, as a practical instruction about danger. Just the plain, direct way a person says it when they mean it about the person, not the situation. A brief pause. "Always," he said, and hung up. Clara set the phone down. At 9:32. Marcus Caldwell walked through the front door. Not with a deputy. Not with anyone from his family's organization. Alone. which was in Clara's experience more frightening than when he brought company, because Marcus without an audience was Marcus without any reason to perform restraint. He came to the counter. I didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her, and his face had that quality it got when something had happened, that he hadn't controlled that specific tight quality around the jaw that his father's face never showed, because Edward had better discipline. Marcus was younger and less practiced, and right now it showed. My mother left the house this morning, he said. I'm sorry to hear that, Clara said. She went to the Whitmore boarding house, Marcus said. She's with that rancher. I wouldn't know anything about that, Clara said. Clara. He leaned on the counter the same way he always leaned on things, with his weight forward, the specific body language of a person who has spent their whole life taking up more space than they were offered. Whatever that man has said to you, whatever he's told you, he can do. You need to understand that the only thing that changes here is how much trouble you end up in at the end of it. I'm not in any trouble, Marcus, Clara said. Not yet. Not ever, she said. And she heard her own voice say it and was surprised by how level it was. How completely, genuinely level. Marcus stared at her. She had never said anything like that to him before. In 8 months of careful, managed responses of perfectly calibrated neutrality and strategic non-confrontation, she had never once pushed back with that particular quiet directness. Something moved across his face, not anger, not yet. Something more like recalibration, like a man adjusting to a new variable. My father is going to call the county about this building today, Marcus said. The lease review has been on the calendar for 3 months. Has it? Clara said. You'd be given 30 days. I see, Clara said. Which means whatever you think you're doing. Marcus, Clara said. Her voice was very calm. It was the calmest she had ever been in a room with him. I think you should go talk to your father. He blinked. I think, Clara said, that there are things happening this morning that your father needs to tell you about, and I think you should be with him when he finds out the rest of it, because you're going to want to hear it at the same time he does. Marcus looked at her for a long, assessing moment. What rest of it? He said. Go talk to your father, Clara said. I have work to do. She turned back to the sorting table. She heard Marcus stand at the counter for another 15 seconds. She counted them, and then she heard him move toward the door, and the bell rang, and the door closed, and she stood at the sorting table with her hands not quite trembling, and breathed through it until they stopped. She had never done anything like that before. She had the sudden, completely unexpected thought that she should have done it 8 months ago, and then she understood with equal clarity that 8 months ago she couldn't have. 8 months ago she had been entirely alone. You could not stand like that in the middle of nothing and no one and expect the ground to hold. The ground held today because there were people on it. She went back to the counter and she worked. At 10:15, Dennis Pratt came in through the back. He knocked first, which he had never done in 11 years, because the connecting door between the post office and the land records office was a shared door, and knocking wasn't the convention. He knocked, and then he opened it slowly, like a man checking whether the room on the other side was safe. Clara looked up. Dennis Pratt was 56 years old, and had the particular physical quality of a man who had spent 3 decades behind a desk, slightly forward curved in the shoulder. The build of someone whose work was sedentary, and whose relationship to his own body was largely incidental. He was also, Clara noticed, pale in a way that had nothing to do with complexion. He was frightened. She had worked next to this man for 11 years, and she had never seen him frightened before. Dennis, she said. I talked to that rancher, Dennis said. He came through the door and closed it behind him. He stood in the middle of the post office back room, like a man who had somewhere urgent to be, but couldn't quite make himself move toward it. I told him what I know. What do you know, Dennis? Clara said. He looked at her. I knew the Halverson survey was altered, he said. Not right away, about 6 months after the fact. I found the discrepancy when I was doing an audit of the 1987 parcels, because someone had requested a historical review, unrelated case, different property. And I found it, and I knew what it meant, and He stopped. He pressed his mouth together briefly. I filed a note in my personal records. I didn't report it. I told myself I needed more time to verify it. And then more time passed, and I kept not reporting it, and eventually it became something you couldn't report without explaining why you hadn't reported it sooner, Clara said. Dennis looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has been carrying guilt so long it has reshaped his face. Yes, he said. Did you alter the survey yourself? Clara asked. No, he said immediately, and it had the ring of absolute truth. I would never know. The alteration was done before the document reached my office. Someone in the filing chain between the surveyor and the county recorder changed the markers on the map. By the time it reached me, it was subtle. If I hadn't been doing the audit, I might never have found it. Do you know who did it? I know who had access, Dennis said. I know who had both the technical knowledge and the opportunity. And I told the rancher. I wrote it down, and I gave him the name. He paused. It's someone who worked for Caldwell Properties as a surveying contractor. His name is Vincent Marks. He's been the Caldwell family's private land surveyor for 15 years. Clara was quiet for a moment. Dennis, she said, did you tell anyone at Caldwell Properties that you'd found this discrepancy? Dennis was quiet for slightly too long. 3 months after I found it, he said. Edward Caldwell came to my office. It was a social visit, he said. He talked about the town, about his family's history here, about how much he valued a well-run county records office. Dennis's voice was completely flat. At the end of the visit, he said, and I remember this exactly, he said, I always appreciate careful, discreet work, Dennis. The kind of man who knows which records matter and which ones are better left alone. And then he left. He and Clara looked at each other. He knew you'd found it, Clara said. He knew, Dennis said. He'd known for at least a month before he came to see me. I have no idea how. He swallowed. After that visit, I kept the note in my personal records, and I didn't touch it, and I didn't speak of it, and I told myself that the Halversons were gone and couldn't be helped, and that speaking up now would only destroy me without helping anyone. But you called Ethan this morning, Clara said. I called him because... Dennis stopped. He looked at his hands. I called him because last night, after I heard that people had been talking, that things were moving, I went home and I sat with my wife and she asked me how I was, and I told her. Everything. And she looked at me and she said, Dennis, you've been carrying this for 2 years, and it has made you old before your time, and the only thing that will make it stop is putting it down. He looked up. She's a smarter woman than I deserve. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, The courier leaves at noon. I need your written statement, specific, dated, the name of Vincent Marks, what you found and when, and what Caldwell said to you. Can you have it ready in an hour? I have it, Dennis said. He reached inside his jacket and brought out a folded piece of paper. I wrote it this morning, after I called the boarding house. He held it out. Clara took it. It was 4 pages. Neat, precise. Dennis Pratt handwriting. That was the same on personal documents as it was on official ones. The handwriting of a man who understood the importance of legibility, who had always understood it, who had just chosen wrong about what to do with the things he could read clearly. Thank you, Dennis, she said. He nodded. He moved toward the connecting door. Clara, he said with his back to her. Yes, I'm sorry, he said. For the Halversons, for not speaking sooner, for all of it. He went back through the connecting door and closed it quietly behind him. Clara stood holding his 4 pages and thought about all the different shapes that silence took in a town like this one. The silence of the Caldwell's design, yes, but also the silence of Dennis Pratt, who had known for 2 years and filed a personal note and said nothing. The silence of Frank Hayes, who had kept a record of his own corruption as insurance and called it self-protection. The silence of Margaret Hayes, who had loved a man doing wrong things and told herself it wasn't her decision. The silence of Dorothy and Tom and Phil and Millie and Lena, who had been afraid and hadn't known they weren't alone in it. All of them silent. All of them carrying it differently. All of them in the end waiting for someone to ask the right question. Ethan Walker had arrived in this town 2 days ago. He had asked the right questions, and everything was falling not apart, but into place. At 11:20, Ethan came through the back door. How was moving with more urgency than she'd seen in him before. Not rushed, but compressed the way a person moves when the timeline has shortened and they've adjusted to it. "The courier is moved up," he said. 11:45. "I need everything now." Clara had the folders and the envelopes already stacked. She handed him Dennis's 4 pages. She watched his eyes move over them quickly. "Vincent Marks," he said. "Caldwell's private surveyor," Clara said. 15 years. "Whitfield is going to want to talk to Dennis directly," Ethan said. "He'll do it," Clara said. "His wife will make sure of it." Something almost like a smile. Ethan added Dennis's pages to the stack. He started for the back door. "Ethan." Clara came around the counter. "There's something else. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you go." He turned. He waited completely present the way he always waited, as if he had all the time in the world, even when he didn't. "This building," Clara said. "If the Caldwells move on the lease today, which Marcus suggested they would, I lose the post office. I lose the job. She stopped. She pressed forward through it. "I need you to know that it doesn't matter. I need you to know that whatever happens to this building, I'm not changing anything. I'm not stopping. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear it." Ethan looked at her. "Clara," he said, "the fraudulent property transfer is in the package going to Whitfield. The moment the state AG opens an investigation, all Caldwell property transactions are frozen pending review. They cannot legally execute that lease termination. And if they try before then they add a count of retaliatory eviction to the list," Ethan said, "which makes the case stronger, not weaker." He held her gaze. "They can't touch this building today without making everything worse for themselves. Edward knows that. He's angry right now, but he's not stupid, and he knows that every move he makes from the moment Ruth sat down with Richard this morning is being watched." Clara looked at him. "You thought of that already," she said. "I thought of that last night," Ethan said. "When I was going through everything in my room. The building was one of the first things I flagged as a potential pressure point." He paused. "I would have told you this morning, but Ruth's call came first, and then everything moved quickly." Clara looked at the man standing in front of her. This man who had arrived 2 days ago with a land survey and a worn jacket, and had, in the space of 48 hours, thought of the building. Thought of Frank Hayes as a future witness. Thought of Ruth as a cooperating source. Thought of every point of leverage and counter-leverage with the same quiet, systematic care that he apparently applied to everything. "Who are you?" she said. Not accusingly, just genuinely. He looked at her for a moment. "A rancher," he said. And then, "Who grew up watching something like this and spent 30 years thinking about what he should have done differently?" Clara held his gaze. There were things in that sentence that she understood were for later, for different circumstances, for a conversation that wasn't happening in 11 minutes before a courier deadline. She put those things in a place she could return to, and she nodded once. "Go," she said. He went. The courier left at 11:47. Clara knew because Ethan texted her from Agnes's phone she didn't have his number, he didn't have hers. Everything had happened through Agnes Whitmore's landline, and Agnes Whitmore's good judgment, which was, Clara reflected its own kind of extraordinary 2 words, package sent. At 12:30, Edward Caldwell came to the post office. Not Marcus, not a deputy, not a phone call. Edward Caldwell himself in person. For the first time in 8 months, walked through the front door of the Willow Creek post office. He was 68 years old, and he was a tall man, not heavy, but solid. The kind of solid that comes from a lifetime of believing you are immovable. His hair was silver, and his clothes were expensive in the understated, deliberate way of a man who wants you to know he doesn't need to try. He wore the face of a man in control, but his eyes were different from the last time Clara had seen him. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has just learned that the ground under his feet is not what he believed it to be. "Clara," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "What can I do for you?" He came to the counter. He put both hands on it flat, the way powerful men put their hands on surfaces when they want the surface to feel like theirs. "I want to talk to you about this conversation you had with my son this morning," he said. I didn't have much of a conversation with Marcus, Clara said. He stopped in, and I told him to go talk to you. I think he took my advice. A pause. Edward Caldwell's eyes moved over her face with the careful attention of a man reading something he expected to understand and finding it unexpectedly difficult. You've been a part of this community for 11 years, he said. We've had a good relationship. We've had a professional relationship, Clara said. Clara. His voice dropped just slightly. Not softer, more precise. I don't know exactly what you've been involved in over the last 2 days. But I want you to understand that whatever that rancher has told you, whatever he's promised you, men like that come to towns like this one, and they make promises, and then they leave, and the people they leave behind are the ones who pay for it. I appreciate your concern, Clara said. This is not concern, Edward said. This is information. I understand the distinction, Clara said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. And for the first time in 8 months, for the first time perhaps in the entire history of their professional relationship, Edward Caldwell looked at Clara Bennett and did not find what he expected to find. He found a woman who was not afraid of him, not performing fearlessness, not overcompensating, not defiant in the theatrical sense, just not afraid. Standing behind her counter in her post office with her hands at her sides and her face level and her eyes meeting his without calculation. Something moved in Edward Caldwell's expression that Clara had never seen there before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was uncertainty. The lease review, he said. For this building. It's scheduled. I'm aware of the lease review, Clara said. I'm also aware that any change to a lease on a property that is currently under review by the State Attorney General's office would constitute, she paused, giving it exactly the weight it deserved, a complicating factor. The silence was absolute. Edward Caldwell stared at her. The State Attorney General, he said. I'd recommend speaking to your attorney, Clara said. Today if possible. I understand time may be a consideration. She watched him. Watched the careful, practiced composure of a 68-year-old man who had never in his life been in this specific position, absorbing this information in real time, recalibrating, calculating. He was still calculating when the door opened behind him. They both turned. It was Sheriff Frank Hayes. Frank Hayes was 57 and had the build of a man who had once been physically strong and now carried the additional weight of years of compromise. He came through the door in his uniform, which he always wore as if it was armor, and he stopped when he saw Edward Caldwell at the counter. The three of them looked at each other. Clara saw it in that moment, saw the specific dynamic of it. Edward expecting Frank to be his reinforcement, his presence in this room, a signal that the sheriff was still his, still on his side, still available as a tool, and Frank Hayes standing in the doorway, not moving toward the counter. Edward, Frank said. Frank, Edward said. Good timing. I know why you're here, Frank said. His voice was different from any version of it Clara had heard before. It was the voice of a man who has made a decision and is living in the 30 seconds after it, before the consequences arrive. I need to talk to Clara. Alone. Edward turned his full attention to Frank Hayes. Frank, he said, and the single word carried 30 years of expectation in it. Not today, Edward, Frank said. Clara watched Edward Caldwell's face. She watched a man understand in real time that something he had believed was secured was not. We'll talk later, Edward said. His voice was even, controlled. A man keeping his composure because composure was the last thing he still had complete ownership of. He looked at Clara once more, that assessing, recalibrating look. Good afternoon, Clara. He walked out. The bell rang. Frank Hayes waited until the sound of it had completely faded. Then he came to the counter. He put a folder on it. Clara looked at it. I know about the package, Frank said. Margaret called me at 11. She told me what she'd given you. He pushed the folder forward. There are things in my personal file that Margaret couldn't have known about. Things that weren't in the documents she photographed because I wrote them in a separate notebook. He met Clara's eyes. Everything in that folder is what was in the notebook. specific dates, specific instructions, specific payments that didn't go into any official record. Clara looked at the folder. Payments, she said. Cash payments, Frank said. From Edward's personal accounts, not Caldwell Properties. 12 of them over 4 years. I kept records because I told myself it was protection. He shook his head. It was guilt. I kept records because I knew what I was doing, and I needed to see it written down to keep believing it was manageable. Frank, Clara said, I need to ask you one question. All right. Last spring, she said, when I came to your office. Frank Hayes's face did something complicated and quiet and real. Yes, he said, before she could finish the question. Edward told you to send me away. Edward told me there was nothing to investigate, and that pursuing it would create problems for the department, Frank said. And I sent you away. The word yes landed in the room and did not move. Clara looked at this man who had sent her away, who had chosen the easier thing, who had watched her walk out of his office and gone back to his desk and filed it away under the heading of things that were not his problem. This man whose wife had photographed his records and whose guilt had lived in a notebook for 4 years, and who was standing here now with that notebook's contents in a folder on her counter. I'm sorry, Frank said. For what it's worth now, I know it's worth very little. I am sorry, Clara. She held his gaze for a moment. It's worth something, she said. Not everything, but something. She put her hand on the folder. I'm going to add this to what's already in Missoula. You understand that means you are now a cooperating witness in an active state investigation. I understand, Frank said. And it means you'll need to talk to Whitfield's office directly, today. I already called them, Frank said, at 11:15. Clara looked at him. You called them before you came here, she said. I called them before I came here, he confirmed. Because Margaret told me that the only thing that mattered now was doing it right. And doing it right meant doing it in the right order. Clara stood behind the counter of her post office. The post office that sat on land the Caldwells had stolen on paper, and that a state attorney general's investigation had now made untouchable, and she thought about Margaret Hayes saying, do it right. Do it in the right order. She thought about Ruth Caldwell looking her husband in the face at 9 o'clock this morning. She thought about Dennis Pratt and his wife at the kitchen table. She thought about Dorothy crying in the back of Millie's Hardware. She thought about Tom Greer's shoulders straightening as he walked out the door. She thought about all the different ways people found their way to the moment when they stopped being silent. Not all at once, not with speeches or heroics, but in the specific, private, unglamorous way that people actually do hard things, which was one conversation at a time, one folder at a time, one phone call at a time. Go home, Frank, Clara said. Be with your wife. Whitfield will call you this afternoon. He nodded. He turned to go. He stopped. Is the rancher still in town? Frank said. Until Thursday, Clara said. Frank nodded again. Tell him thank you, Frank said. I know that's not adequate, but tell him. He left. The bell rang one last time. Clara stood in the quiet of the post office. Outside, the afternoon was moving forward. The town of Willow Creek was going about its business, its routines, its ordinary forward motion of a Tuesday in October, entirely unaware that by the end of this day, the structure that had governed it for 30 years was already irreversibly dismantled. The walls had not fallen yet. Edward Caldwell was in his office, or in his car, or on the phone with his attorney. Marcus was somewhere doing something he believed was still useful. Deputy Carroll was probably still watching Agnes Whitmore's boarding house. None of it mattered. The package was in Missoula. Frank Hayes had called Whitfield, and Ruth Caldwell was sitting in Agnes Whitmore's front room, 4 years of evidence already in the right hands, waiting for the world to catch up with the decision she had made a long time ago. At 3:45, Ethan came back. He came through the front door this time, not the back, and he walked to the counter, and he stood there, and he looked at her, and he said, "The state AG's office opened a formal investigation at 2:30 this afternoon." Clara put both hands flat on the counter. "Formal investigation," she said. "Based on the package from Whitfield, Ethan said, "and Frank Hayes's direct call to their office at 1 o'clock. They are treating it as an active case." Edward Caldwell's attorney received notice at 3. He paused. "All Caldwell Properties transactions are frozen effective immediately pending review." Clara looked at him. "It's done," she said. It wasn't entirely a question. "It started," Ethan said. "There's a difference. The investigation will take time. There will be hearings and depositions and legal processes. It won't be fast, and it won't be simple." He held her gaze. "But the part that depended on silence on this town staying quiet and staying separate and believing they were alone, that part is done." Clara stood behind the counter. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the old post office windows. She'd seen it 10,000 times and never paid attention to it. The way light at this hour came through the glass at a specific angle and landed across the counter in a long flat band. She paid attention to it now. "I need to close up," she said. Her voice was quiet and genuine and a little unsteady, and she did not try to manage it. "I need to close up and go home." "I'll walk you," Ethan said. She didn't argue. She turned off the lights in the back. She gathered her coat and her keys. She walked to the front and she turned the sign from open to closed the way she had done every day for 11 years. Then she stood at this door for one moment. She put her hand flat on the glass. She felt the cold of it and the solidity of it, and she thought, "This is mine. Whatever paper says, this is mine. 11 years. This is mine." Then she opened the door and walked out into the October afternoon with Ethan Walker beside her, and the street, Dorothy's diner, had its lights on. Through the window, Clara could see Dorothy behind the counter moving in the familiar, practiced way she'd moved for 30 years. Dorothy looked up. She saw Clara. She raised one hand, not a wave, just a raising of the hand. Acknowledgement. Presence. "I see you. I'm here." Clara raised her hand back. Ethan said nothing. He walked beside her with his hands in his jacket pockets and his hat on, and the particular unhurried quality of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. And Clara Bennett walked home through Willow Creek in the late afternoon of a Tuesday in October, and the town around her looked exactly as it always had, ordinary and quiet and small, and she knew that tomorrow it would begin to look different, and the day after that more different still, and that what was coming would be difficult and long and not without cost. But tonight, walking through the cold air, with the sound of her own footsteps on the pavement, and a man beside her who had kept his word in the simplest and most complete way, by simply staying tonight, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And Clara held on to that feeling, the way you hold on to something you know is real, when the days that follow try to make you doubt it, because the days that followed were not easy, and nobody who had been honest with themselves had expected them to be. The investigation did not move the way movies made investigations move. There was no single dramatic moment where the doors flew open and the handcuffs came out and justice arrived in a clean, visible shape. What came instead was a process, slow, procedural, relentless, in the specific way that legal machinery is relentless when it finally starts moving in the right direction. Depositions. Document requests. Freeze notices on accounts. Attorneys in Missoula making phone calls to attorneys in Helena, making phone calls to the state AG's office, which had assigned 2 investigators who arrived in Willow Creek on a Thursday morning in November, and spent 4 days in the county records office with Dennis Pratt, who had apparently decided that full cooperation was the only version of himself he could still stand to be. Edward Caldwell hired the most expensive defense attorney in Montana within 48 hours of the AG's office opening the formal case. Richard Caldwell hired a different one and spent the first 2 weeks making it quietly known through his attorney that he was prepared to cooperate in exchange for consideration, which was exactly what Ruth had expected him to do, and which Whitfield's office had already factored into their strategy. Marcus Caldwell left town. He left on a Wednesday 3 weeks after Ethan had walked Clara home in the October afternoon. He loaded 2 vehicles and he drove north, and nobody in Willow Creek saw him go, but everyone knew by noon that he was gone, the way small towns know things through the specific texture of an absence that has been anticipated. Clara heard about it from Dorothy, who heard it from Agnes Whitmore, who had watched the vehicles pass her boarding house window at 6 in the morning. When Dorothy told her, Clara stood behind the counter of the post office, and she felt not relief, not triumph. Something quieter than either of those. Something that felt more like the end of holding your breath for so long that you'd forgotten you were doing it. The slow, careful intake of air that comes when a danger has moved far enough away that your body believes it. She didn't celebrate. She sorted the morning's mail and processed 2 certified letters and helped old Mr. Peterson with a package form he'd been filling out incorrectly for 3 years. And she did all of it with the particular grounded attention of a woman who has learned that ordinary things done well are their own kind of anchor. Ethan had not left on Thursday. He had told her he was planning to leave Thursday, and Thursday came, and his truck was still at Agnes Whitmore's boarding house, and Clara had not called to ask about it because she was not sure what she wanted his answer to be, and she needed to be sure before she asked. He came into the post office that Thursday afternoon with mud on his boots and a coffee from Dorothy's black no sugar. Dorothy had apparently made it a standing arrangement, and he set it on the counter in front of her and said, "The back order at Millie's came in late. Some of it wasn't right. They had to reorder." Clara looked at the coffee cup. "Hardware takes time," she said. "It does," Ethan agreed. He stayed through Thursday. He stayed through the following week. He was at Millie's often enough that Millie started calling him by his first name and keeping his particular bolt size in a separate bin, which in Millie Brandt's world was the equivalent of a formal declaration of belonging. How was at Dorothy's every morning. He walked the streets of Willow Creek with the unhurried, observant attention of a man who was learning a place, not just passing through it. He talked to people not about the investigation, not about the Caldwells, just the way he always talked to people, asking how they were doing, and meaning it, listening to the answers with his full attention. And slowly, in the way that things shift in small towns, when the weight that's been pressing down on them lifts. Willow Creek began to breathe differently. Phil Tanner. At the pharmacy, stopped leaving his back office door open, the way he'd kept it for 3 years, always ready to disappear before the wrong person walked in. He started standing at the front counter in the mornings, talking to customers, the way he used to before the Caldwells started using his lease as a pressure point. Dorothy raised her prices for the first time in 4 years, not dramatically, just correcting for what she'd been afraid to charge, and not a single customer complained, because everyone in town understood what those prices had meant. Tom Greer's brother-in-law came back to Willow Creek for a weekend in November. He stood in Tom's gas station and looked around at it for a long time without speaking, and then he said, "I thought I'd never want to come back here." And Tom said, "I know." And they stood together in the way brothers stand when they've been through something that took years and cost more than it should have and is now finally in the past. Clara watched all of this from behind her counter and from her kitchen table in the evenings, and from the slow walks she began to take in the mornings before the post office opened, because she was learning how to have time again. Time that wasn't spent managing fear or calculating distances or monitoring the sounds her house made in the dark. She was learning carefully and imperfectly how to live in a town that was no longer a trap. 3 weeks after Ethan should have left, he came into the post office on a Monday morning, and he didn't bring coffee. He came in, and he stood at the counter, and he looked at her with the same direct, unhurried attention he had always given her, and he said, "I need to tell you something." Clara put down the package she was processing. "All right," she said. "My ranch is 40 minutes north," he said. "I've been neglecting it badly, and my ranch hand is a patient man, but he has limits." He paused. "I need to go back, legitimately. The cattle don't care about land surveys, and they care less about investigations." Clara looked at him. "Okay," she said. "I wanted to tell you directly," he said. "Not just I didn't want to just go." "I know," she said. The silence between them was warm and a little complicated, and neither of them rushed it. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "I'm going to come back on Friday," he said. "I have some business at Millie's that needs follow-up." He held her gaze. "And I was thinking, if you're not occupied on Friday evening, Dorothy mentioned the diner does something specific on Friday nights. A dinner she's particularly proud of." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Dorothy has been doing Friday dinners for 20 years, Clara said. "She's been particularly proud of them the whole time." "Then it seems like something worth trying," Ethan said. Clara held his gaze. She thought about the first morning. The bell above the door, the way she'd turned around slowly, the calculated neutrality of her first look at this man. She thought about her hands on the counter pressing down, stopping them from shaking. She thought about whispering, "You don't have to save me," in the voice of a woman who had practiced saying nothing for so long that the truth had nearly forgotten how to come out. She thought about what he'd said on that first morning that had undone 8 months of carefully constructed distance in 4 words. "I'm not leaving." He had meant it. She understood now exactly how he had meant it, not as a promise of rescue, not as a declaration of ownership, not as the kind of staying that asks for gratitude or debt. He had meant it the way a person means something when they have looked at a situation clearly and decided where they stand. He had stayed because staying was the right thing, because silence was also a choice, and he had made a different one. Because somewhere in the hills north of Willow Creek, a 12-year-old version of him had watched someone he loved go unprotected and had spent 30 years deciding who he was going to be when he saw it happen again. She thought about Ruth Caldwell's 4 years of evidence, and Dennis Pratt's 2 years of guilt, and Frank Hayes' notebook, and Margaret's signed statement, and Tom Greer's folder 2 inches thick, and Dorothy crying in the back of Millie's Hardware. She thought about all the different forms courage took in a town that had forgotten it was allowed to have any, and she thought about herself. Clara Bennett, 11 years behind this counter. 8 months of silence. 3 days of watching a stranger ask the right questions and refuse to look away. Standing here now in the ordinary light of a Monday morning, hands, still voice level, no longer performing anything for anyone. "Friday," she said. 7 o'clock, Dorothy's. Something moved across Ethan Walker's face that was the most complete version of that almost smile she had seen across all the days she'd known him. Not a performance, just a face responding honestly to something that pleased it. 7 o'clock, he said. He put on his hat. He nodded once, that weighted, deliberate nod, and he walked out. The bell rang. Clara stood behind her counter and listened to it fade, and she did not press her hands flat to stop them from shaking because they were not shaking. She was steady. She had been steady for a while now, and she was still learning to notice it, still catching herself bracing for the ground to shift under her feet and finding that it held. She went back to the morning's packages. At 11:30, the phone rang. It was Whitfield's office in Missoula, one of the junior attorneys, a young woman named Kara Simmons, who had been the primary contact for the last 3 weeks, and who had the specific, energized precision of someone working a case they believed in. "We have a hearing date," Kara said. "February 14th, State District Court in Missoula. All counts: the property fraud, the coercion, the obstruction, and the related charges against Frank Hayes as a cooperating witness." She paused. "Richard Caldwell's attorney has confirmed full cooperation. He'll testify against Edward." Clara was quiet for one moment. "And Edward," she said. "Edward's attorney filed a response this morning," Kara said. "They're contesting. But Clara, with what we have with Frank's testimony and Ruth's documentation and the surveying evidence and the witness statements contesting is a formality. It delays, but it doesn't change the outcome." "How long does contesting delay it?" "Honestly, if he contests everything aggressively, another 6 to 12 months on top of the hearing date." A pause. "But here's what's important. The asset freeze stays in place regardless. The shell companies holding the building titles can't transact. The business properties revert to county review pending resolution. Everything the Caldwells have built financially is locked." "Including this building," Clara said. "Including that building," Kara confirmed. "And Clara, when the property transfers are reversed, which they will be, the post office building goes back to county property. Your lease reverts to its original terms. You're protected." Clara put her free hand flat on the counter. She was not pressing down. She was just feeling it, the solid, real, 11 years familiar surface of her counter. "Thank you, Kara," she said. "Thank Ruth Caldwell," Kara said warmly. 4 years of documentation is what made this case. Everything else confirmed and built on what she had. A beat. "Oh, and Clara. Whitfield asked me to tell you specifically. He says the signed statements from the community members, Dorothy, Tom, Phil, Lena, all of them, Those personal testimonies are what converts a financial fraud case into a full community impact case. That changes the sentencing guidelines significantly. Another pause. He says to tell you that whoever organized that collection did exceptional work. Clara thought of a Tuesday morning, people around a table in the back of the post office. Dorothy's biscuits, 7 o'clock light, voices low and careful, and finally saying the real things. It organized itself, Clara said. I just opened the door. She hung up. February 14th. A hearing date. A locked case. A building that was hers. She thought about what Ethan had said to her on that first morning, the thing she'd carried with her every day since. What he's done to you, it's not because of anything you are. And it's not because of anything you did. And it's not because of anything you failed to do. She had needed to hear it said out loud. She understood now why. Because she had been telling herself for 8 months that it was manageable, that she was handling it. That silence was strategy, and strategy was survival. And all of that was true, and none of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had been alone inside it. And being alone inside something for long enough makes you mistake the loneliness for the thing itself. Makes you forget that the weight you're carrying doesn't belong to you. Makes you start to believe that the darkness is the shape of the world. She wasn't in that darkness anymore. She had walked out of it not because someone had rescued her, but because someone had refused to pretend not to see it, and that refusal had been enough to remind her that she was worth the seeing. On a Friday evening in November, Clara Bennett walked into Dorothy's diner at 7 o'clock. Ethan was already there. He was at a corner table, which was the table Dorothy had clearly designated for them, because Dorothy considered table assignment a form of editorial comment on human relationships, and the corner table was Dorothy's warmest, most private one. He stood when Clara came through the door, not performatively, just the way a man stands when someone he's been waiting for walks in. She sat across from him, and Dorothy appeared within 30 seconds, with the kind of speed that confirmed she had been watching the door. The special tonight is pot roast, Dorothy said with the energy of a woman who had been looking forward to this moment. I've been making it since 3 o'clock. We'll have the special, Ethan said. Obviously, Dorothy said, already turning satisfaction emanating from her like heat. Clara looked at Ethan across the table. He looked back. The diner around them was warm and lit and full of the ordinary sounds of a Friday evening, people eating, talking, the particular low hum of a community going about itself. Clara knew every voice in the room. She had sorted their mail and stamped their packages and said good morning to them for 11 years. She knew them differently now. Not more. She wasn't sure more was the right word. Differently. The way you know people when you've been afraid with them, when you've sat in a back room at 7 in the morning and put things on the table that cost something to put down. It was the kind of knowing that doesn't go away. How's the ranch? She asked. Settling down, Ethan said. 3 days of neglect in cattle terms is manageable. 2 weeks is a different conversation. The almost smile. My ranch hand Gary, he's worked for me since I bought the property. He's 62 years old, and he's forgotten more about cattle than I'll ever know. And when I got back Monday, he looked at me for about 5 seconds, and then he said, "You look different." What did you say? Clara asked. I said things had been different, Ethan said. He said, good different or bad different. I said both. He looked at her. He said, that's usually the only kind that matters. Clara held his gaze. Smart man, she said. Best judgment I've ever hired, Ethan agreed. Dorothy arrived with the pot roast, which she set down with the ceremony of a woman presenting something she was rightly proud of, and which smelled like every good thing about winter in kitchens, and the specific comfort of food made with patience. They ate. They talked. Not about the investigation that was a thing that was happening and would continue to happen and didn't need to be carried into every room. They talked about his ranch, about the specific quality of the hills north of town in the early winter, about the property lines he'd come to settle and how they connected to land his family had owned years ago and lost, and that he'd spent 12 years working his way back to. About his mother briefly, the shape of her absence in the story of what he'd done with his life, how it had carved certain things in him, and he'd learned to stop resenting the carving and understand it as the structure he'd been given. About Clara's 11 years at the post office. About what it had meant to her in the years before everything went wrong. The real thing. The honest thing. The way she'd loved the specific function of it being the person who connected people to the things they were waiting for. Letters. Packages. Documents that meant something. The small but genuine importance of the in-between. "You love that job," Ethan said. It wasn't a surprised observation, just a confirmed one. "I do," Clara said. "I spent 8 months trying not to, because loving it meant they had something to take from me. But yes, I do." "Good," Ethan said. "It suits you." "The efficiency," she said. "The care," he said. "You care about every piece of mail in that place. You care about Mrs. Henderson's pile, even though she's been dead 4 years." Clara looked at him. "You remembered that," she said. "You told me the first morning," he said. "It was the first thing that told me who you were." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the first morning, the certified letters, the archive room, the way she'd automatically prepared the county form before he asked for it. The small practice things that she did out of genuine care for the function of her work, that she'd kept doing, even when everything around them was wrong. "The hearing is February 14th, she said. "I know," he said. "Kara Simmons called me too." "You're in regular contact with Whitfield's office. They have questions sometimes about the survey evidence," he said. "The boundary markers, the technical aspects. I'm technically listed as a material witness for that piece of it." He paused. "I'll need to be in Missoula for the hearing." "So will I," Clara said. "So will most of Willow Creek," Ethan said. They looked at each other across Dorothy's corner table in the warm light of a Friday diner in a Montana town in November. And Clara understood something that she had been understanding slowly for 3 weeks, one day at a time. The way understanding actually arrives when it's the real kind. She understood that this man was not a visitor anymore. He had not been a visitor since the second morning when he'd come back with 2 cups of coffee and set one on her counter without asking if she wanted it, just already knowing already there. He had become something that didn't have a name in the early going, but that had acquired one over the weeks that followed. Something that felt like presence, like the specific gravity of a person who is where they intend to be. The ranch was 40 minutes north. He was coming back on Fridays, and Fridays had not been discussed as temporary. She did not say any of this out loud, because some things didn't need to be said to be real. Some things were real precisely because they didn't need announcement, because they had already happened in the quiet accumulation of coffee cups and honest looks, and 2 people being exactly themselves in each other's presence without calculation. She had spent 8 months calculating everything. She was done with calculation. "I should tell you something," Clara said. Ethan waited. "The morning you walked out," she said. "The first morning when you'd seen my wrist and you left, I went into the bathroom and I sat down and I stayed in there for a full minute until I stopped shaking." She looked at him directly. "It was the first time I'd felt shaky from something other than fear in a long time." He held her gaze. "I didn't know what to do with that," she said. "I still wasn't sure after you came back, or after the meeting at Millie's, or after any of it, honestly. I kept waiting to find the part of it that was performance, the part where you wanted something in return for what you were doing." "And," he said. "And it's not there," she said. "I've been looking, and it's not there." "No," he said, "it's not." "I'm not good at trusting that yet," Clara said. "I want you to know that. I'm getting better at it. But I'm not good at it yet." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not in a hurry." "You never are," she said. "Some things," he said quietly, "are worth being patient about." Dorothy appeared with pineapple, which Clara hadn't ordered, and which Dorothy had clearly decided was happening regardless, and set it between them with the expression of a woman who was pleased with the world and was not hiding it. "On the house," Dorothy said. "Don't argue." She left before anyone could. Clara looked at the pie, then at Ethan. Then she laughed, really laughed the way she hadn't laughed in a long time, from the actual bottom of it, from somewhere that had been very quiet for a very long time and was not quiet anymore. Ethan watched her laugh and his whole face changed, not to the almost smile, but to the real version of it, the one she hadn't seen until this moment, warm and unguarded and entirely his own. "Dorothy," he said, "is my favorite person in this town." "Don't tell Millie," Clara said. "Millie knows," he said. "Millie agrees with Dorothy's assessment of herself." They ate the pie. Outside, Willow Creek was doing what it always did on a Friday night in November. Quiet cold, lit in the specific way of small towns in early winter. The few businesses still open, casting warm rectangles of light onto the pavement. A town that looked exactly as it always had, and was not what it had been. The investigation would take the months it took. The hearing would come, and the testimony would be given, and the evidence. Ruth Caldwell had spent 4 years building, would do what evidence does when it's complete and documented, and in the right hands. Edward Caldwell would fight it, and eventually run out of things to fight with. Frank Hayes would testify and carry the weight of that for the rest of his life, and possibly become in time a man his wife could fully respect again. Richard Caldwell would cooperate, and still lose most of what he had built, and wake up every morning in the knowledge of what he'd been, and find a way to live with it. And Willow Creek. Willow Creek would recover in the slow, uneven, imperfect way that communities recover when a long pressure is lifted. Some things would come back easily. Some things that had been broken would stay broken. Some people who had left would come back, and some would not. And both of those things would be what they were. The town would not be the same. It would be better, not in the cleaned-up, simplified way of stories that resolve too neatly, but in the real way. The way that includes the loss alongside the gain, and knows the difference between the two. Clara would be in it. She would stand behind her counter and sort Mrs. Henderson's mail and process certified letters and help Mr. Peterson with his package forms and be the person who connected people to the things they were waiting for, because that was her work, and she loved it, and it was hers. She would not be alone in it. At 8:45, Clara and Ethan walked out of Dorothy's diner into the November night. Dorothy watched them go through the window with the expression of a woman who was satisfied with the way she had chosen to spend her evening and her apple pie. They stood on the pavement outside the diner. Clara could see the post office down the street, dark now sign turned to closed, ordinary and solid, and entirely hers. "Friday was a good idea," she said. "It was Dorothy's idea," Ethan said. "I just asked the right question." "You have a habit of that," Clara said. "So do you?" he said. She looked at him. He looked back. 40 minutes north, she said. "That's not far." "No," he said. "It isn't." "Good," she said. "Just that. Just the word, clean and complete, and meaning everything it meant." She walked home through the cold November night, and her footsteps were steady, and her hands were still, and her face held nothing that needed to be managed. She was Clara Bennett. She had worked in the Willow Creek post office for 11 years. She had survived 8 months of something that would have broken a great many people, and she had not broken, and she was not pretending she hadn't bent. She had bent, and she had held. And those two things together were what surviving actually looked like when it was real. She had watched a stranger walk into her town and refused to look away from what he saw. And she had watched that refusal become a permission that spread through people who'd been waiting for exactly that, not to be rescued, but to be reminded that standing up was still possible. She had handed a man a certified letter form she'd already pulled before he asked, and that small act of care had begun something that neither of them could have planned. She had whispered, "You don't have to save me," to a man who hadn't been trying to. He had been doing something harder and more lasting than saving. He had been seeing her. And Clara Bennett, who had spent a long time being invisible inside a town that had chosen not to look now, walked through that town, in the full knowledge that she was seen by the people who had sat around her table at 7 in the morning by the woman in Missoula, building a case that would last by the man 40 minutes north, who came back on Fridays, and that being seen truly, and without performance, was the thing she had been fighting for all along, without having a name for it. She had the name for it now, and she would not forget it again.